What can be better than a Techstrong gang from our studio headquarters in Boca Raton? Coming at you from CubeCon in Salt Lake City. You're watching Techstrong Gang. All right. Hey, everyone. It's Alan Schimmel, and I'm here in Salt Lake City for CubeCon and Techstrong Gang. You know, we have a lot of our gang members here in various places around town here at Salt Lake City. It's a busy CubeCon. I think there's like 24 tracks going on today and more. But Mike Vizard and I are here bringing you a special edition of Techstrong Gang. And happy to do it. We've got some really big news, but I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Yeah, I would argue we have the biggest news of the entire show. We're launching
platformengineering.com. Look, that's probably a hard URL for you to remember because I hate hard to remember URLs. But it's a little bit of DevOps.com all over again for me, Mike. You know, there's something to be said for a good domain.
It's deja vu all over again.
Did you like that? That was my yogiism. Did they know a yogiism in Salt Lake City?
I don't know, but I think there's a couple of Yankee fans out there that.
All right, that was my yogi. It's deja vu all over again.
So we launched this site off of some research that we did for the DevOps Next project. And one of the things we found there was, and it surprised me, but 61% of respondents said that they were involved in some form of a platform engineering project. Might not be across the entire organization, but they were citing benefits included things like developer productivity, standardization of configurations, reducing costs, and reduce complexity, and even improve security were all drivers of this thing. And the numbers weren't very far apart for all 5 of those things. So it seems like there's a big benefit total, and I'm not sure anybody's hanging their hat on one thing, or is it 5 things?
First of all, 61%, not 56. But you did cite the source for that. Yeah. So I'll go with it.
All right.
So, you know, I have a couple of articles up today, one on platformengineering.com, and few of our other sites, I have other articles geared to them, but around platformengineering.com. You know, not to get all Barack Obama-ish on you, but I've gone through my own evolution.
You have?
On platform engineering. Look, when it first came out, I'll admit it, you know, these guys were, some of the folks in the community were trying to make their bones by saying DevOps is dead and long live platform engineering. You know, I hear that word, trying to make their bones. I was making bones when you were dating cheerleaders, as Mo Green would say. And so immediately I had sort of this anti-platform engineering thing as the publisher of DevOps.com. But over time, I came to realize that that's clickbait marketing stuff. Platform engineering is not here to replace DevOps.com.
No, I don't think that was ever the issue.
No. Well, some people were saying that, but what I think we've seen is what your numbers bear out. And it's not your numbers, it's the research we did in our DevOps Next report, right? DevOps has done amazing things in breaking down silos between dev and ops and bringing security into the whole SDLC, software supply chain security, SBOMs, all these things. It's done amazing things working in a cloud native environment, right? In this whole stack. But it's also put a big burden on developers.
True that.
That whole shift left thing of, yeah, the developer will do it, the developer do. So you're taking your highest paid resource in many cases and putting more non-development work on their plate. And that to me is the reason why platform engineering needs to be. We need to give these developers an environment that allows them to go fast. To me, it's like if these developers are maglev trains, we've got to put in those maglev tracks and guardrails so that they can go as fast as that maglev train can go, right? And that's what platform engineering does. It sets the environment. Now, is it truly new? No. I think a lot of what platform engineering ops folks were already doing, system architects were doing, but it's put it all together in the context of a modern software development life cycle. And I think platform engineering becomes the architect of the new software factory.
I think about it in a similar fashion with some other um, caveats wrapped around it. I think part of the DevOps revolution was kind of a reaction against the overly rigid, centralized IT teams and CIOs that were limiting productivity because people were stuck in these platforms that were not extensible. They couldn't add new tools when they wanted. So developers went out and created their own platforms to go do that and decided they were going to manage that. That, in many regards, to your point, became too much of a good thing
Right.
because then they got saddled with all this stuff that had nothing to do with writing code. I feel like we're trying to find the medium between two extremes now, where we had DevOps shifting everything left and we had CIOs where everything was going to be run from the right hand side. And I think we can get to some sort of middle here that makes everybody happy. And that's the challenge. It's not easy to do. You got to create everything from internal developer portals and self-service systems around that. So it takes work. The thing I don't know for sure is going to happen yet, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, is how big is this? Because at some point, do we bring together all the IT operations folks so that DevOps and ITSM are all part of the same platform engineering team? I mean, how big can platform engineering
Yeah.
get?
So I think you're looking at it wrong in some respect. It's not that platform engineering subsumes all these other things. I think you got to look at it. I'm going to use a big word here. I hope I don't scare you, but you got to look at it as a pantheon of frameworks, of processes, of ways of doing things.
Wait, I see some Greek gods.
Yeah, that was from the Greek. I'm about to take out my Windex here and start squirting. But uh, there's a pantheon that includes platform engineering, that includes DevOps, that does include ITSM, that includes Agile. Maybe it even includes a little waterfall. It includes SRE,
Yeah.
DevSecOps. All of these things are pieces, components of the software factory, of the IT factory that modern organizations need to run at the speed of business today and what customers expect. So it's not that any one of these swallows the other. It's this continuum of these are all the pieces.
I will agree to disagree on this one
Okay.
point because I'm also looking over my shoulder at all this AI stuff. And as I see that coming down the pike, the one thing that's consistent about it is we're looking at the democratization of IT, and it's going to be easier for people to manage more complex systems. And not all of those folks need to be engineers, right? We have armies of IT administrators now who can manage a Kubernetes cluster with the right tool. We have folks who are administrators that may be able to stand something up and apply the patches without being a developer. So I think that there's some room here with this platform engineering thing. I don't, without sounding too much like Kumbaya, might actually bring everything together.
So to me, you're asking the macaroni and spaghetti question, right? All spaghetti is macaroni, but not all macaroni is spaghetti.
Mm-hmm.
Do we get to a point because of AI and things that all platform engineers are engineers, but we don't need engineers to do platform engineering?
I'm not quite saying that. I'm saying that administrators can function like engineers. We'll still need higher end engineers, but we'll never have enough engineers as it currently stands. So we have to elevate the IT administrators to let them
So
manage.
they
more.
become platform engineers.
Yeah, junior platform engineers might be one way I would think about it.
Right, so we can make an official junior platform engineer. That's something I aspire
Get you a
to.
little badge and
Right.
everything.
What do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a junior platform engineer, sir. Um, look, it's real. There's a sizable community. I think most of the folks who work around the factory have recognized this now as a real need. Um, I think what we'll see, and I wrote this in one of the articles, I forget which one, on platform engineering, is what effect AI will have across all of these all these disciplines, excuse me, all of these disciplines. And I think in some ways it'll bring them together. In some ways it'll maybe drive a wedge. I mean, overall, I think it'll be a good thing. But platform engineering is real. That's what I want people to take out of this. Platform engineering is real. It's a real thing that's needed and it's working. I want to talk about the site though. What can people expect at platformengineering.com, Mr. Chief Content Officer?
The site itself, the articles are going to be more thought leadership generated. So there'll be articles from practitioners, IT leaders, folks who are, what are the challenges of implementing all this stuff? I don't think it's going to be so hardcore news driven per se, although there'll be news stories on that site, but it'll be more about let's kind of build a community to have this conversation in the first place, because I continue to stand pat. I believe we're on the cusp of the great convergence here. I think platform engineering, the site, is the place to have that conversation.
Okay. And the site is there to have that conversation. I'll also add to it, though, Mike. We'll be doing webinars and Techstrong learning events around platform engineering. Of course, we'll be dedicating some real resources here on Techstrong TV to platform engineering, as well as the family of Techstrong podcasts. We'll be having a platform engineering entree into that. So, I'd like, and again, I wrote it in my articles. At Techstrong, we're about busting down silos. See what I did there?
I'm always.
And I think that's what we're going to be doing here with platform engineering, bringing it into the family of Techstrong, with platformengineering.com, bringing it into the family of Techstrong sites, taking its rightful place alongside DevOps.com, Cloud Native Now, Security Boulevard, Techstrong AI, Techstrong ITSM, and of course, Digital CXO.
Yeah. I'm not sure we need to knock down every silo. Silos have a purpose and a platform, and separation of engineering concerns is helpful. But right now, I can't navigate all these silos.
You know what I'm doing right here? I'm ducking so the DevOps gods don't hit me with the lightning they're going to strike you with.
But I think there's a lot of room to bring all these silos together in a much more federated fashion, and I'm looking forward to it.
Fantastic.
Right.
Hey, Mike. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back. We might have a guest even joining us. You're watching Techstrong, gang.
All right, folks, we're back. And as Alan mentioned, we're at KubeCon, which is one of the biggest gatherings of the open source community, maybe the biggest. It's hard to measure these days. But I kind of feel like every time I look at open source, it's like looking at the best and worst of times. Everybody's having an argument about, gee, we're having an awesome time. And others are saying we're not having an awesome time. And it starts to feel like a Victorian novel in my mind. But
I thought you were going to say it's the U.S. political landscape.
Could be.
It's too soon.
Too soon. All right. Sorry. Too soon.
Well, we got Brian Fox, who's the CTO of Sonatype, joining us for this little chat. And you've been looking at this as long as we have, maybe longer. I mean, what is your sense of what's going on here? Because there's been a lot of high-profile forks.
Yep.
And there's a lot of arguments about the role of vendors in this space. And at the same time, without vendors, there's no ecosystem at all, because there needs to be money in this system somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're entering probably a new phase in the maturity curve of open source. I mean, open source is more popular than ever. Everything we use, any piece of software has open source in it these days, and a significant amount of open source. 90% of the code base is often made up of open source components. And so it's more critical than ever. You're seeing increased attacks on the ecosystem, on software in general, on technology in general, and where open source is such a critical foundation of that. By extension, there's a lot of focus on that underpinning. And I think as we move forward, it's going to get worse before it gets better. We're seeing legislation in the EU from the Cyber Resiliency Act, the Product Liability Directive. I think those things are going to cause organizations that are consuming open source to focus on the underpinnings even more. They're going to have higher expectations, which at first might not be welcome. I predict that will become the new norm. But when you think about vendors in open source and some of the forks you mentioned, I think what we're grappling with is the sustainability of some of these things, right? I mean, it's one thing to create a project that is sort of a pet project, solves a problem for you and put it out there and work on it willy-nilly. But you get some of these big, huge open source projects that we see represented at this conference. Those cost real money to produce. I heard a stat, I was at a CISA sponsored thing earlier in the year where they got all the package registries together. And I heard that one of the major database, federated database open source projects, it costs something like $60,000 each time they do a release to run the CI infrastructure. Somebody's paying for that. The open source project's not paying for it. The users of that project are not paying for it. Somebody's kicking in that bill. That party will come to a stop at some point until we unless we figure out the sustainability.
I was a political science major in college. And one of the things they taught us when we looked at modern political theories and systems was that democracy was the best of the worst.
Yeah.
And the same thing I think applies to open source. Yeah, it's not perfect. Yeah, we're running into scalability issues and market issues and government, regulation issues. But there really isn't anything better out there.
No, I think that's a
right?
perfect analogy. It's not great, but
it's the best of the
it's
worst.
better than closed source in most dimensions for sure.
So if you have something better, let's hear it. But if not, let's just try to make this the best it can be.
Yeah.
And I think just like in democracy, there's a bit of a cha-cha, one step forward, two steps back kind of thing. Mm-hmm. There is fits and starts.
Yeah.
And stops, but through it all you learn and you progress, and I think that's what we're seeing.
Not all democracies are the same though, and some of them are not as quite as open as others. Mm-hmm. Same thing seems to be applying in the open source world, and we're seeing it now in the AI world where they're arguing about what's an open source AI model and what's not, depending on how much access you have to the weights and the data. So are we just going to continue to have this conversation forever, or
no? Like I said, I think using the lens of any other mature industry, open source is still sort of in its teenage years, let's say, right? As compared to auto, food, and you've heard me use these analogies forever.
I was best behaved in my teenage years. What are you talking about?
Yeah, we all were. At least we thought, right? So I think we're going through that. I mean, some people have coined, the phrase post-open to kind of represent some of these things. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it. I think, you start from the beginning with like the really dogmatic, copyleft and everything is free, the Free Software Foundation. And then you get a little bit more liberal with, Apache and some of these other things as these evolved, right? We started in this, everything should be free for the public good. But I think we've now struggled with multiple different models over the last couple of decades of companies being able to be successful building on open source, whether it's the open core model or the Red Hat providing services model. And those work to an extent, but I think now with some of these forks that we're seeing that real tension between how do we create something that is really good for a set of users to build upon, but how do we also make it in a way that is fundable, like VC fundable, because these big projects, if a company can't exist behind them, most of them won't exist on their own. Like that's not true, it's not a perfect model. In some cases they will, but in a lot of cases they're not. And I think we have to be a little bit more open to, like you said, there's different flavors of democracy. Things can be open but still have companies behind them. And Sonatype, we've been doing this now for almost
20 years?
18 years.
Yeah.
And we have a little bit of mix. We have stuff that we do that's pure open source, right? We run the Maven Central Repository. That's not a profit center. We spend a lot of money for that. We have Nexus open source, which is mostly an open core model because we sell Pro on top of it.
Sure.
And then we have our supply chain stuff that's pure commercial, right? So I've kind of had to live all of these different models. And so I feel like I have a unique visibility into like the dogmatic versus the purely capitalistic side.
Well, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you this question. The times that we've seen people change their licensing models, it doesn't seem to work all that well. What happened? One with high-profile case led to an acquisition. The other one retreated and came back around and said, never mind. So
Yeah.
a lot of people look at this as a signal of financial distress when these companies do that. So how would you possibly change the licensing terms after you've already established the community anyway?
Well, first of all, there are rules in open source that allow you to do this. You could take something, I'll go back to the security industry. And Brian, you know this. When we first got into security, there were some fantastic open source security tools run by some fantastic people. Our friend Ron Gula at Tenable, Nessus was open source. Marty Rush's Snort, ClamAV, Nmap, and the list goes on. And they ran into the same issues that Hashi and some of these other companies are doing at today. It's not just, am I not making money or I'm not making enough money? Part of it is, hey, I'm shouldering a large percentage of the cost of maintaining this project. And then there are other people who are just taking my product,
Right.
putting it under the covers and building a project on top of it. And they don't contribute anything back to the community. They're kind of
That's
parasitic.
unfortunately the norm.
Right.
You know it is.
Or they're cloud service providers that are just running the
They're doing it as well. And so now I'm going to disagree with you on changing licenses can be bad for business, because you know what? Ron Gula's not hurting, and neither is Marty. They've made Tenable's done pretty well, and SourceFire sold, I don't know, $2.6 billion years and years
Cisco.
ago to Cisco.
Yeah.
So you can't, and Hashi sold for a couple $2 billion too, didn't they?
Yeah, but I think that it felt like
Mitchell.
Felt like a little bit of a distress situation.
Well, there was pressure to do something. But that being said, Brian, you said something before that's important, and that is about the cost of running a large open source project. I mean, I've had a chance. We work with a lot of the foundations within the Linux Foundation, and I've had some insight that I can't really share on here, and what it costs to run some of the major CD products out there.
Yeah, for sure.
It's seven figures.
It's shocking. It was shocking to me, like that stat I shared before. I was like,
Yeah.
wow.
No,
never
it's
thought about that.
7 figures a year to maintain these things. Infrastructure.
And it's going to get worse, because, go back 20 years. It was totally the norm when I was actively coding on Maven that I would do the work. I was a release manager. I built it on my laptop.
Yeah.
The version that got included in OS X Snow Leopard was signed by my key and built on my personal laptop. That was the norm.
Right.
It was kind of cool to be able to say that.
No, it was.
Also, that was a norm. Now you look at that and go, wait, this person that I don't know just built something on hardware I can't trust? That's
and you want me to trust it, right?
Right. That's not acceptable anymore. Well, okay, fine. Let's put that on a CI/CD system. Great. Who's paying for that? Right. So it's not as simple as it was 20 years ago, where the donation was my time to write some effectively text and then maybe run a short build. Now the expectations are high. They're going to be higher as we're expected.
Mission
people to
critical.
Run. That's right. They're running more and more tools. Those things that while they're in the cloud, they're still not free. Right.
So you're telling me that this hat that he's wearing, if I pass it around, that's not going to work?
Well,
Probably not.
Let's talk about, but that's the next thing I wanted to. So that's the beauty of the Linux Foundation model. A little socialism gets added to this democracy mix, right? We bring in everybody, we bring a community together around a particular open source project. And the idea is people who have the deeper pockets and have more of an investment in that project and are profiting from it, maybe they should pay a higher share of the cost of maintaining that project
Mhm.
than a smaller company or certainly an individual or anything like that. And so that, I think that's a valuable function of what the foundations, the Linux Foundation and all these CNCFs and all the OSSF, what they all do is they try to bring that community together, not just to make the project better, but to have those who can afford to pay into it pay
Yeah,
in.
they're paying into the infrastructure and the governance and some of those things. And
Yeah.
I think, like I said, as the world expects more and more of open source, those funds are going to become even more important.
Yes.
It may not be paying the developers.
No.
It may come to that in
Well,
some cases,
right.
But it may, but at least the infrastructure has to be
What
covered.
about the
and that's-
maintainers?
Yeah, yeah.
These maintainers, I mean, it's a thankless job in many ways.
So what do you say to the, using your metaphor, the radicals who go off and build a fork and then undercut those companies?
I mean, look, in democracy and freedom of speech, they're entitled to go do that,
I agree. Yeah.
right? And if it's a better mousetrap, the market will reward them. In many cases, I don't know if it's a better mousetrap.
Yeah, in many cases it's not, because the core people that have all the knowledge, it's not just about the code base.
Right.
You know, if you don't know anything about it, it's not very useful to you. And so, but that's not always true. Sometimes there can be successful forks. I don't begrudge any of them. I think everybody is playing by the rules of the game.
Yeah.
And, you know, some people will get upset about it, but I think that's how it's set up. If you don't like the model, you can fork it. And if you can muster the resources to make that successful, well, that was in the rules of the game, right? But it's also, nobody can force a company to pay for maintenance and pay maintainers to work on something they give away for free indefinitely. And if you insist on that model, then all of these companies
Unreasonable.
become unfundable, and we won't be able to have these innovative things available to us. So it cuts
I
both
think
ways.
there's also millions of forks that people don't talk about. Every company that downloads something winds up tweaking it in a way that creates some sort of
But under open source licensing, if you change that code, you're supposed to make it back and you publicly, you've got to make it available to the project.
Depends on the license.
I thought all OSI licenses, you had to do that.
No,
No.
the Apache one, for example, you don't have to. The copyleft ones you do, GPL,
Okay, yeah.
EL to some extent,
Yes.
LGPL.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not
So it,
Apache.
like your democracy comment, there's the spectrum. So in some cases it's okay. Some cases you're supposed to do that and people don't, and so that's not okay.
There's
right?
a lot of things we're supposed to do that we don't do.
No,
Right?
but let's look historically, right? The fact of the matter is, historically, companies with deep pockets like IBM or Intel, or not Microsoft, IBM or Intel, drawing a blank here, but they would have certain people on their payroll who really worked on open source projects full time.
Yep.
But it was kind of I forgot the right term that you use. You serve at the what of the queen, at the
pleasure.
pleasure. That's the word I was looking for. You served at the pleasure of IBM, and they could change their mind and say, we don't like this project anymore.
There's
That's not a good.
yeah.
It's not sustainable.
You can't do
Yeah.
mission critical on someone's goodwill.
That's right.
That's why you need a real
The survey that
place.
you guys put out found that there are people getting paid by companies, but it wasn't that many. It's not nearly as many as I thought.
Yeah, that was the state of the software supply chain
Yes.
in combination with the tide lift data. Yeah, I don't remember the percentage. It's a small percent.
Right.
However, we also found in our study this year, of the popular ecosystem, there's about 7 million components. Only about 700,000 of those are actively used, downloaded, included in projects. So it's about 10%. That's a more tractable number to try to fund.
get your head around.
Yeah, and so, you know, I think there's a decent number of those that are getting funding, you know, and their data shows that you know, maintainers that are paid are like 3 times more likely to
effective.
do all the things we want. They have less vulnerabilities. They fix them faster.
Yep.
Right. So it shows that it works.
Yep.
And you know, it sort of boggles my mind. There was, I think it was one of the Harvard studies recently, you know, estimated that the the outward-facing economic value of open source is something like $3 trillion. So in other words, if open source went poof, all the commercial entities worldwide would have to pony up
Have a
$3
$3
trillion
trillion
more
hole.
to fill that hole. Why can't we find 0.1% of that would cover most
All
of
of
these
it.
maintainers, right? It would be a windfall to change this game. And so the thing is, it's such a small amount proportionately that we're talking about here could really move the needle.
Mr. Capitalism, he's saying compensation drives behavior.
No, so I'm a free market person, but you know, a pure market could be brutal. Pure free market's brutal. You need a little socialism in there. But let me bring up another issue. Orphaned projects.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are a lot of projects that maybe were originally sponsored by a handful or one company who then gets bought, moves on, whatever.
Yeah.
And now you've got a whole community that's using this software and it's kind of orphaned. And, you know, in many ways, the Linux Foundation is the orphanage.
Well, yeah, as you were saying that, I was thinking of a bunch of cases where it's sort of like a cut and dump kind of model where those projects just dump them onto an open source foundation and walk away. Sometimes they're able to build a community, sometimes not. It's very hit or miss. And that's an unfortunate model where they say, you know what, we're moving on from this, so let's just.
See, so Dickens did have it right. It's Oliver Twist and Please May I Have Another.
Right.
Thank you, sir. May I have another?
But, you know, if
Well,
those
we've got Animal House.
If those companies that are dependent upon that were involved, were putting in some funding or dedicating their own engineers to get involved, they would ensure that there was a succession plan for that project, right?
Yes.
Just by being involved. And that's kind of the point here. It doesn't always have to be money, but having your engineers be involved in the projects that you're really dependent upon can change the trajectory of that. And it's illogical to me why companies would put all of their eggs in a basket that somebody else holds. That's effectively what's happening if you're using all this open source and you're not involved at all. You're at the whims of whatever things happen.
And you want to build your business around that, and you want someone to invest in that business
That's right.
around that.
That's right.
That's a scary prop. Hey, Brian, I appreciate you just letting us pull you in like this.
Yeah, this was fun.
It's always fun to have you on. Anything other big news, Sonatype, or you personally here at KubeCon this week?
Yeah, we're here. We have an activation zone. We're talking about open source malware. You know, we've covered this a bunch of times. Intentionally open source malware components. There's 700,000 as of a couple months ago that we've tracked. And this is an interesting stat. Remember, I told you that 10% of those open source projects, that's also 700,000. So we've crossed the point now where there are more intentionally fake, harmful components in the open source ecosystem than the ones that are actually used every day. And that's an understood milestone.
So an activation zone is a place I'm trying to avoid or go to.
No, you want to come? We've got some. You can pick between the different things and see if you found your malicious component or not.
All right.
If you're watching this, go check it out. Brian Fox, Sonatype, here on Techstrong Gang. We're going to take a break. We'll be back.
DevOps.com is the #1 online destination for DevOps education and community building. DevOps.com covers all aspects of DevOps, including DevOps best practices and tools, DevOps culture, DevSecOps, business impact, continuous testing, continuous delivery, and more. DevOps.com has the largest collection of original DevOps content, featuring breaking news, blog posts, podcasts, and more. Visit www.devops.com to learn more. DevOps.com, where the world meets DevOps.
All right, folks, we're back with our final segment, and we're talking about, well, the relationship between Kubernetes and AI infrastructure. And I'm not sure people realize that most of all these AI platforms that are out there, underneath that, at the bottom of those things, is Kubernetes. And what the next big argument about is now is all those platforms, whether they were built by Microsoft or whatever, are kind of do-it-yourself projects. They built it from the ground up themselves. Enterprise IT organizations don't really have that capability. So you see companies here like Nutanix is showing the next rev of their AI infrastructure platform. And they're saying that that's going to be a little more of a turnkey kind of platform. And we're not going to see necessarily so much of this do-it-yourself infrastructure approach to Kubernetes and cloud native that we saw in the previous era.
I agree with you. So it's funny. We have an interview coming up later today, Mike, with a guy named Alex Yee from its GMI Cloud, GMICloud.ai. Alex's company, and I interviewed him on Techstrong TV a few weeks ago. Alex's company is doing just that. They have pre-built GPU clusters, but on top of that metal, using cloud native Kubernetes containers, etc., they have built stacks that include all the way, like true platform as a service, right? All the way up to the building blocks of your apps, your LLMs, your trained models, your stacks to do certain common tasks within an app. And you could almost building blocks build your app like it. I do think that's the future. No one, well, not no one, but very, very, very few organizations will have the resources to train their own models. Everyone today says, yeah, I'll put it in a vector database and train it up, and I'll have my own custom LLM. Doing custom LLMs from scratch, I think, are going to be, it's a dead end.
It's hard work. I think this conversation comes full circle to our A block. I think as people start to move down these AI models, and some will be large and some will be small, the only way we're going to get to that is with some sort of centralized platform engineering approach. And I also think that part of that conversation then is also the melding of this whole ML ops framework that people use for building AI models and DevOps. And that's got to have to come together, because ultimately all those AI models are just another type of software artifact that we're putting into the application. So all of this stuff has to converge. And I'm not sure if we're all going to come up with some, platform engineering for AI methodology, or we're just going to say, hey, it's all the next generation of software engineering.
I wouldn't confuse platform engineering with what's the right word when you have models, pre-configured models?
Well, there's the models that you get, the big LLMs, then you can either customize the LLMs or you can build a small.
No, but I think what we're going to have is there will be, and whether it's platform engineering folks doing it or not, there's going to be best practices for certain models, for certain outcomes that are not turnkey, but like they're 80% baked, and you
templates.
Just do the that's the word I was thinking. That wasn't really the word, but templates is a good substitute of the word I was thinking of. Well, you'll have these templates, and that it's 80% baked, and you just do the rest.
Prefabricated house, baby.
I think that's the future. No one wants to build from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
And quite frankly, that's the beauty of the whole cloud native model, right? You could take these containers, like literally Legos, and build your containers, into your this here, that there, and they're pre-populated too. I mean, what could be bad about that?
I think it's getting a little hard to manage. What you told me this number? There's like 180 cloud native projects these days.
Yes, there are.
I think that's
on the way to 200.
Yeah,
plus.
I think that's too hard for the average enterprise to absorb. So that needs to find some other way to consume all that in something that's easier.
But that's I don't know if you remember, it was maybe a year or two, they tried doing a flow chart of all the cloud native computing foundation projects. It looked worse than the spaghetti models on our hurricanes back home. But that being said, my grandmother used to tell me, every pot of chicken soup has a cover. She'd say some other things too, but she said that.
Okay.
I don't think you have to use all 180 models
or projects,
of open source. But there's so many different use cases within that tech ecosystem that I think those 180 projects represent a diversity and depth of giving you so many options in how you want to build, what you want to do. So it's a sign of health, not a sign of sickness.
I just might want somebody else to kind of make that decision and take some responsibility for it.
And you know what? That's, again, you know what a big democracy, free market person I am. Um, but that's the beauty of our system. You want to grow your own, roll your own, you can roll your own. You want to buy a pre-roll? Have I been in Colorado lately? You want to buy a pre-roll? You could buy a pre-roll.
Yeah.
That's America. Or used to be America.
So if you were going to bet, is the bulk of the market going to be more of these integrated platforms, or is it going to be the do-it-yourself, or is it going to be the small percentage, or 50-50? What's your sense of how that splits?
You know, it's going to be about using the right tool for the job. I think it's going to cut across big and small. There'll be times where a big organization says, I just need this widget. And this widget's already here. I'm going to buy that widget and use it. There'll be other times where they'll say, you know what, this is core and critical to our company. We got to own this. And they design it themselves.
All right. I'm going to vote for the 80-20 rule. 80% will
Well,
be...
you can never go wrong with 80-20.
80% will be pre-integrated, and then the do-it-yourselfers will make up the other 20%. They'll be big companies then.
But I think there'll be a dumbbell of the 20%. 10% will be big companies who roll their own, and then the other 10% will be hyper small companies who want to roll their own because they want to do something they believe that's radically different.
Right. And then they're going to change their minds when they figure out how hard that is and go to the integrated
They may very well.
We'll
Or
see.
maybe they invent something new.
Yeah, we'll see.
That's the creative process. Anyway, Mike, we're off to a great start here for Techstrong Gang at KubeCon. We have a full day of live at KubeCon content coming your way. And we'll be here the rest of the week. We have Techstrong Gang from KubeCon on Thursday and Friday as well.
Yep.
As well as interviews and content all day. So stay right here by this dial, same bad time, same bad station for Techstrong Gang. On behalf of Mike Vizard and Alan Schimmel, have a great day, everyone.
Discover Techstrong Group, the epicenter of tech innovation. We're your go-to for reaching IT leaders and practitioners worldwide. Our secret? Impactful content that sparks awareness, engagement, and top-quality leads. With us, you'll access editorial websites, streaming videos, virtual events, custom content, analyst research, and more. Join our satisfied clients. Let's revolutionize your tech journey. Contact us today and tell your story to the world in the most powerful way with Techstrong Group.
This is Techstrong TV.
Hey, everyone. Welcome back here to Techstrong TV. I'm really happy to have this next guest on. His name is Corey Minton. Corey is Field CTO for our friends at Splunk. Hey, Corey, welcome to Techstrong TV, man. It's great to have you on.
Man, I'm very excited to be here. I've been a fan for a long time, bumped into you at conferences over the years. And frankly, just glad to chat with you today.
You know, I was taping Techstrong Gang this morning, and someone said, was IT broken because, we're always trying to fix things? And I said, of course, because that's what IT people do. We like to fix things. I said, unless my security friends. We like to break things, then fix them so that they're better than they were before. But that's what security people do. And if you don't understand that about security people, that's why you're not in security. People don't get that sometimes. I mean, at a high level. Corey, when you and I got into security, you didn't go to college for a cybersecurity degree or these things, right? You got into it because you like to break things and fix them. And that's
exactly
what we
right.
did.
It's the best way to learn. Build your lab and break things, learn how they break.
Absolutely. There's got to be somewhere in here. But anyway, Corey, you know what? But that's actually a good segue. Give us a little bit about your journey into, security and being here as Field CTO of Splunk.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Thanks again. Yeah, my journey is kind of, I've had a lot of fun, and I candidly have the most fun job, I think, within the company. As Field CTO, it's my job to talk with our customers on a daily basis, share with them where we're making investments in our products and our technology and our capabilities, and then hear from them directly, like, hey, is this the right strategy? Are we solving the right problems? And taking the feedback on where we can improve, where we can do better, taking that back and being a liaison to our product and technology engineering organization. And so it's a fantastic gig. I have lots of great opportunities to hear from customers, and that's my favorite thing, is like being in the real world, understanding at the front lines what's happening. But prior to that, I've been at Splunk for almost 5 years. I've been a Splunk customer and partner before that for nearly a decade. Built a practice at EMC and at Dell Technologies to help customers deploying Splunk and other large-scale AI and big data systems over the years. And I've really just been a tinkerer and a consummate student of, what's happening in the space of, big data, AI, and machine learning. And now, given the transformational nature of what's happening for so many enterprises today, that experience has been, super helpful. And it's been kind of helping me form and shape some hopefully strong opinions on where I think we can make investments and continue to drive our customer success forward.
Absolutely. Believe it or not, I still remember like when I first became aware of Splunk. Jesus, it's got to be 2005, 2006, maybe 2004, in that range. And they had really good T-shirts. They were just plain black T-shirts, but with really cool sayings on them.
Mm-hmm.
That was Splunk for me. But then that was enough to get me to the booth or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then to understand what the product does, I'll never forget. I came back from whatever show we were at, and I said, "Man, that's a company I'd love to invest some money in," because it was just like, the ability to just capture anything and everything was back then, right? That was pretty radical. Yeah, it was radical. It was, of course.
I was going to say, one of the things that we struggled with whenever I became a customer was just that like large scale distribution of
That's
data.
what I was going to say.
That like, especially, in the early days, I think Splunk's, their core mission was really on that, like, how do we deal with that traditional architecture of, a lot of times 3-tier, but things in our data centers, how do we, instrument the infrastructure and so that we can kind of understand what's happening at the application layer, and that solving that problem at the scale that we were solving it was a challenge. And so I think that's where Splunk's, like in the early days, as you talked about, was really interesting. It was like, hey, we have this really interesting way where you can instrument anything. You have this unique way where you lay data out, where you can ask kind of any question, and you're not bound by some particular schema that so many of us are used to in that, data warehouse world, where you have to structure all your questions before you lay out your data. And it really just became this tool that you could do so much with. And what happened for, a number of years is it was like we were burgeoning and kind of figuring out like what are all the interesting use cases. And really over the last decade, it's become like abundantly clear that the majority of our Splunk customers use us for either security, right? Security is a fantastic data problem to go solve on large scale amounts of distributed systems. And then really on this observability space and observability meaning, bringing visibility to applications run in our own data centers or in the cloud or in the mix in between. And that's really where this report, this state of observability report comes from, is like, hey, we're trying to get a grasp on what's challenging the world of observability. What are the things that good observability practices have in common so that we can all learn together from them? And then what are those key areas of investment where, hey, if you have a platform like a Splunk, then what are those areas where the real leaders are doing like great things in terms of return on investment and, efficiency enhancement. So it's been a fun ride, and we've got a fantastic kind of year or two ahead of us, especially with the fantastic Cisco acquisition. So,
yeah, I mean that, so Cisco beat me to buying Splunk, but I probably wouldn't have come up with the 30-something billion anyway, or whatever it was. So,
yeah,
more power to them. But all kidding aside, people at first were like, "Wow, Cisco bought Splunk. Is it going to be part of their security stack?" And they, Cisco, obviously, those of us in the security space know Cisco's, gone through some changes in their security division. A lot of folks I know came over from the Duo acquisition, which, was the big acquisition until Splunk, have moved on. Or was there other, observability is more than security, right? Kind of like macaroni, well, spaghetti's macaroni, but not all macaroni is spaghetti. Um, so, and, look, anytime you get an acquisition, there's always some eggs broken making the omelet. Talk to us about, what's been your experience and what do you think we can expect from this Splunk Cisco, marriage?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a fantastic one. I think there's been leadership changes that I think that give very good indication that Cisco wants to treat the Splunk acquisition with, great respect for who Splunk has been and our history and the things that we're great at, and how do we, bring that value to life across the Cisco portfolio. And so having folks like, who Gary Steele, who was the CEO of Splunk, comes in as now the president of all go-to-market operations for Cisco, says that, hey, we think that that's a leader that knows how to build businesses that are scalable and solving enterprise challenges. If you look at the ways that we've integrated our security and engineering, our security and observability teams to make sure that there is, we're picking the best capabilities from the platforms and we're learning, like, what are those key features across, let's say the observability tools that were existing acquisitions for or existing products within Cisco. What can Splunk learn from those products? How can we integrate best with them? And what we found is that there's just this like great synergy between what we all do and what we do well. While there may be some products that do some similar things, most of what we found is that it's different customers who use them, and there's some reasons why you would choose one versus the other. And so what we're really focused on is how do we help, customers who've made investments extract the most value, get the most, efficiency from their use cases when they do have investigations that may span across platforms. How do we integrate them so it's seamless and smooth and highly efficient, so we keep people out of the business of, big war rooms and these, this awful situation when something bad happens. Like, let's give them the data, let's give them the tools, the intelligent navigation. How do we use AI assistance to drive them forward to make them more effective? It's really been the focus. And so I'm excited to be here. I'm really excited about the investments that Cisco is making in Splunk, the things that people like Chuck, the CEO of Cisco, have said around how we're going to do this differently. We're going to make this a great experience. He actually talked about it in some of our executive roundtables during our last user conference. He's like, we told the board of directors we're going to take some time on this one and really make sure we do it right. So I think it's that thoughtfulness from the top and the synergy that exists between our products and the ways that we've brought together those engineering teams. I'm just seeing customers be, one, very bullish and excited about it, and they're just asking for more. They just continuously say, hey, how can you help me get the most from this? And so I think what Cisco brings in terms of the, that amount of telemetry data that's now a new source that maybe Splunk hasn't had as much unique access to, just means that customers are going to get even more value from Splunk going forward.
Excellent, man.
Yeah.
Excellent. Hey, we're going to run out of time, so I want to make sure we get onto this report. So Splunk State of Observability Report 2024. You guys have been doing this report for a number of years now. We've been covering it. In many ways, 2024 reports, as we come to the end of the year, it's kind of the year where we're seeing AI have a real effect. It's not in full effect. There's still plenty of hype out there, but it's real enough where it's having effects. I'm wondering, when you look at the report, Corey, what jumps out at you as kind of being really kind of important?
Yeah. So, for a little bit of background, the State of Observability Report, this is our fourth one that we've done, our fourth annual report, and we plan to continue to invest in this report. And it's really a survey of about 1,800, IT operations, observability, software engineering, software development team folks, where we go out and have conversations with them about, what are they having success with? What are the challenges that they're facing? And, kind of assessing them on their effectiveness and where they kind of fit on this maturity spectrum of having, really a world-class observability organization. And what sticks out to me is, one, yes, AI is still very much one that teams are looking for. How do I apply it really intelligently, but with some caution on, I want to make sure that I keep a human in the loop. I don't want to turn over too much to AI. But I think it's also an area where what we're hearing is that AI is becoming a new digital service that organizations need to bring observability and security to it. So I think it's really an interesting space. I think some of the big ones for me, I think in terms of key metrics and, that I think folks will be interested in is, one is, anytime you're investing in software, you're doing so because you're trying to buy an outcome, right? You're trying to get some outcome that's harder to get, that's hard to do on your own. And so I think what we find is that the observability investments that the real leaders, the folks who have really powerful observability practices, they're seeing what in the report, they said over 2.6x ROI on their investments in observability tools. And that means that they're seeing that if you do observability well, you connect real visibility to the business and how those underlying applications and the process of bringing those applications to life, you start to really understand that business context. And that's a powerful differentiator, I think, in the market, is that when you don't just understand what's happening in my cloud environment, but actually how is those underlying technical services and how are those services affecting my revenue generating customer facing applications in meaningful ways? And how am I avoiding that downtime? And how am I getting my teams focused on the power, the really important stuff? Like that's one of the other I keep finding. Like people say like 57% of folks that we had responded said that they're struggling with alert fatigue. Like people are just getting overwhelmed by the amount of data and these alerts that are happening. And so you talk about AI, that's one of the best areas that we're seeing return on investment is how do I use AI tools to correlate and bring context to them and get focused on the right stuff?
Yeah. I mean, look, this has been a problem, the desensitization and vulnerability data, since I was selling vulnerability data in 2003, right? But back then it was job security, right? You'd deliver a yellow page. People don't remember what yellow pages were, but you deliver a yellow pages size, vulnerability report, dump it onto some security network guy, and he'd spend all year, fixing what he could, not fixing what he couldn't. By the time he was almost at the end, it was time for a new report, and it kind of job security. Of course, today it's much different. You mentioned AI. I think one of the things we're seeing, Corey, and I'm interested is so-called agentic AI, right? We have all these agents that will do a lot of this for you, right? You can have an agent that finds vulnerabilities, an agent that fixes vulnerabilities, an agent that manages those agents, right? And so on. How does that play into Splunk's plans? Kind of, everybody wants to use AI, but is that you see that coming?
Yeah, I think that the desire for AI to accelerate outcomes is kind of a universal goal in the, in enterprise software. It's like, how can I leverage the, amazing amounts of research that have been done in frontier and foundational models? How do I bring that into my product in meaningful ways that at the end of the day just brings customers what they expect from us even faster? And so we've been on a journey. One, I'll tell you, like, I think of AI in two ways, at least in terms of like where Splunk is working with customers. I think one is, how are you bringing observability to the enterprise AI applications you're developing? So are you instrumenting those well so that you can understand cost, performance, utilization, usage across the enterprise for the purpose of solving things like, traditional observability problems of, are they performing as they should? Right? Are they performing as expected? How much am I spending on the development and running of these kinds of applications? So that's one area that is ripe with opportunity. I think lots of organizations are trying to figure out, how do I secure those applications? How do I bring modern observability to them? And that's one we've got lots of fantastic customers doing interesting things with open telemetry, which is really a bedrock for finding across observability. That's a key capability, is like standardizing your instrumentation methodology on OpenTelemetry. And even in the AI stack, that's a big deal. We've seen that 72% of the leaders in that observability space have standardized on OTel. And I think that's true as we look at the current and next generation applications that are going to be deployed in the enterprise. That needs to be a standard. The other way I'd say it is like, we're manifesting AI in our products, much like, other organizations are thinking about it. And we're doing so in a thoughtful way. We want to make sure that they're, domain specific. Like, we're not going to make a, cat image generator. We're going to make security tools and observability tools,
People who maybe want you to do that,
it's outside of our bailiwick. Like that's not
Yeah,
what's
I get it.
so we're trying to focus on what they, what they know us to be great at. And so it's really around security and observability, AI capabilities. We've been shipping a lot of machine learning and what we call foundational AI in the product for years to help extract, signals from non-human scale data sources, right? That's been Splunk's superpower. Where we're investing now in some of the AI that we think is next is really in this AI assistant concept, which is like, how do I build AI assistants to go meet my analyst where they are, meet my SRE in the tasks that they typically end up in Splunk for, right? Am I having a latency in an application? Am I having carts being, abandoned for some, end user, experience problem? How do I bring AI to say I can identify and alert against what's happening and I get focused on, and then I use an assistant to say, here's the way to go solve those problems, right? Here's the next best action to take. And so we started with an AI assistant for SPL, which is, hey, how do you ask questions in Splunk more effectively? Have an AI do natural language transition. And then over the next year, you'll see us releasing these assistants in our core products, in our security products, in our observability products that will accelerate the outcomes. And that's really the goal. Is at the end of the day, it's like, how do I get them moving through an investigation faster? And we actually had one of our customers in our private preview experience. They did an A/B test where they actually had two groups working on solving like a scenario where there was a latency in an application. And in the A/B test, the team that they gave them access to the observability assistant, they solved the problem 75% faster than the team without the AI assistant. And to me, that's like the aha moment that you really that folks want to see, which is, can the AI accelerate my outcome? And we proved it, you can. And so the early adoption has been really encouraging. And I think that we're just going to see more excitement build as those products, mature and the applications get more focused. And then, I think agentic AI is part of it. We'll be building agentic AI in ways that just make sense. Like, can we figure out a way to use it in a security and observability context to derive an outcome? Then absolutely.
Hey, we're about out of time. I want to just mention, for anyone who wants to maybe go download the report, you can get it at www.splunk.com/en_US campaigns/state-of-observability.html. An easy way is probably just Google Splunk's 24 State of Observability report, right? You can get it there. Corey, thanks for coming on here, man. Now that you've been here, don't be a stranger.
I would love to.
Right? Splunk's always got something cooking. We'd like to hear it, but we cover it usually, whether it's on Security Boulevard or DevOps.com or Cloud Native now, or even our AI, ITSM, and digital transformation sites. We're always covering Splunk. So come on back here and keep us posted, okay?
Sounds great, man. Appreciate the time today.
Appreciate your time. Corey Minton, Field CTO for Splunk, here on the Splunk State of Observability Report 2024. Go check it out. We're going to take a break on Techstrong TV. Techstrong TV. We'll be back in just a moment.
This is Techstrong TV.
Hey everyone, we're back here. We've got just coming to the end of our Qualys Security Conference coverage here this year in San Diego. It's been a great 2 days. Our next guest is Anu Kapel.
Yes.
Got it right?
Yeah.
Okay. Anu is with Qualys, but Anu, tell us a little bit about your current position at Qualys and maybe a little bit about yourself, your history.
Yeah. So I work in Qualys. I'm the Senior Product Manager for Policy Compliance. I have been with Qualys for over 8 years. I've worked in engineering roles and eventually I transformed to product side. Compliance is my passion. I would say I have worked in compliance for almost 8-9 years now in Qualys. And being the product manager for compliance, I get this opportunity to interact with customers, understand their pain point, and ensure what innovations or what capabilities can we bring in the product so that their use cases are sufficed and the product is used by customers and they are happy with it. So yes, I have an engineering background. And I'm learning cybersecurity each and every day as it's evolving and changing.
And, that's an important thing. We were just talking to Dino DiMarino,
Yes.
the chief revenue officer, about, how he's had, not only him, but the whole team has had to kind of relearn how to talk about things like risk and compliance. And because security is changing, it's not static.
Yeah.
Right? Talking earlier to Jerry Hughes from one of your partners, Compass, about changes in PCI. That's some big changes coming through. You just presented here, though, on the stage. If you don't mind, tell our audience a little bit about what you presented about.
So today my talk was around how you can be audit ready from spreadsheets and be continuously audit ready. We all know as soon as we hear audits, it's more like a fire drill. Everything is in a sense of urgency. Everything has to be done right now, right there. But we don't have to wait for audits. We can be continuously audit ready with Qualys policy compliance. And compliance is no more a checkbox. Gone are those days. Compliance is more of a business enabler, because if an organization fail an audit, it's the business risk. Business operations could come to a standstill. It's threatening to an enterprise. So they need to be continuously audit ready. And it's not like when you have an audit, then you get all your documents, do it in a manual way. It's a lot of cost, time, effort to organizations. So basically they need a tool which helps them being audit ready continuously all the time, so they are not surprised. They don't have to go out, look for more siloed processes, solutions, spreadsheet, and move to a more automated, streamlined solutions and have those comprehensive reports ready, which can be given to the auditors at any time they ask for it.
I've always believed that if you do security well, you will be compliant, right? Because I've never met a compliance regulation that wasn't in line with best practices for security.
Yep.
And so if you do your security well, you'll be compliant. And if you do your security well and you're compliant, you shouldn't worry too much about an audit, because when you do it right, it all lines up correctly. Sounds good in practice,
Yep.
right? Doesn't always work that way. So it is important to have something that helps you automate that. I will tell you, as the CEO here at Techstrong, we're not big enough to really go through a huge audit per se, but what happens is a lot of our vendors, a lot of our sponsors are. And so they send us their third-party compliance, and it's like an audit kind of thing where you got to show them proof of your compliance, of your policies, of your everything. And we don't have anything like Qualys compliance audit.
Yep.
And it is such a major lift in our organization. I feel bad because I don't fill it out, though I'm probably the best one to fill it out. I know it well.
Yeah.
But I pass it off to a guy on our team named Greg Yarnold. And this poor guy, he has to pour through the spreadsheets and the instructions and get all this information. And it takes, for us sometimes, it takes weeks to really gather it. It is, I don't know why we haven't gotten a solution like yours yet, to tell you the truth, because it would make my life eeasier.
That's true.
Because like I said, we're not that big. It shouldn't be that big a problem. And we do decent. Fact of the matter is, us, like many companies, we outsource, we SaaS everything.
Yeah.
So 99.9% of what we have is it's not us, right? Our data is stored there, but so what we have found that the right thing to do is write to your third party, write to the HubSpots that we use and the hosts that we use and so forth. And they have to show their compliance because they're the ones who are doing it. But this is a major pain for, I think it's a major pain for small companies. I think it's a bigger pain for bigger companies, though, too.
Yeah, it is. It's like you said, security and compliance blend in together. They are kind of the sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
It has to go in parallel. I know with more and more cybersecurity attacks, the more budgets are moving towards risk, but compliance, it's important. You cannot just wake up and think you need to be audit ready. And it's not just the technical part of it. There's always this compliance documentation, like I spoke in my talk. Usually for bigger enterprises, it takes around 22,000 man hours for just compliance documentation. That's like 30 to 40% of the framework requirements. And then mapping it, it's a challenge from start to end. So you do need an automated continuous.
22,000 man hours?
Yeah, that's per the Deloitte survey. Yes.
That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah. Here's the good news. We're getting more compliance stuff that
Yes.
will need audit, right? The EU put in this DORA. I'm sure you're familiar,
Yes.
right? And that's coming out. They also passed a new AI
Yeah.
compliance thing. There's rumors that the Congress may actually get off up their butts and do something on a federal level. We have all these state
Yes.
ones now. It's increasingly
Yes. So the compliance complexities are evolving. They are getting added day by day, year by year. It's so complex that to keep up to that, if you're doing it manually, there's always a scope for human errors, and it's complex. You might fail an audit, or the auditor might ask for more reports. There's back and forth, and a lot of man hours cost in terms of that. So you do need an automated solution that makes your life easier, rather than doing it manually with all these siloed tools, processes, Excel sheet, that eventually is a lot of work and might not even get you a passed audit.
no. So we're in the spreadsheet. Someone once told me, if your biggest competitor is a spreadsheet, you got a good business.
That might be true.
Yeah, I think it is. And you know what? What we use now is a spreadsheet,
Yes.
unfortunately. And it's hard. Let me ask you a question, though. How do you, I mean, best practices are best practices, I guess. But how do you, like, do you have pre-done templates for every single compliance?
Yeah,
Or
we do.
virtually every compliance regulation?
Yeah. So with policy compliance, Qualys policy compliance, we provide these audit-ready mandates, templates for security assessment questionnaires for all these mandates like NIST, CIS standards, PCI, DORA, whatever the new AI mandates are coming in. So you just have these audit-ready templates. You just need to fill in. We have done the hard work of mapping the requirements to controls. You just fill the form and generate the reports, and we do all the mapping. And the report is just as it is. It's a beautiful report that auditors love to see it, instead of the spreadsheets where they have to drag and back and forth is involved. So these out-of-the-box policies, templates, and framework mapped makes the job really easier for customers to use the solution and generate those reports for auditors and be audit ready at all the times.
I love it. I don't know if you can talk about this or not, but how is it priced based on how big the organization is, how much audits you need? How do you price something like if I wanted to buy it, what is it going to cost me?
Well, it depends. There are SME, SMB, enterprise packages.
Okay, that's what I mean. So there's different levels
Yes.
depending how big your organization is.
Correct. Yeah, we have different packages, licensing based. You're gonna use hybrid sensors or scanners, agents. We get the data from everywhere with the hybrid sensors and connectors.
So it does everything then. It does your vulnerability scans,
Yes.
everything like a VMDR does almost.
Yes. Yeah.
And so is this a module within VMDR or is it standalone?
It's a standalone module, but we have a tight integration with VMDR, like the TrueRisk. Now,
Yes.
the data for policy compliance misconfiguration goes into the TrueRisk. So it will show you what your TrueRisk score should be up or down with the misconfigurations data that is coming in. Like I mentioned, that your SMB port might be open, that might lead to WannaCry ransomware. And those misconfiguration might be missed if the data from policy compliance was not coming in. So it provides a real visibility of what your risk exposure is, so that you could remediate that.
I love it. For people who maybe want to get more information, where can they go?
They can just subscribe to, come to Qualys.com and start the trial for policy compliance with a free 30-day trial.
Free 30-day trial too. What more could you ask for? Thank you so much for coming on. I know you came literally right off the stage. They were running late, so I appreciate you running on here. Best of luck, and we'll keep it posted. We'll keep us posted on this.
All right, thank you.
All righty. All right, we've got one more video to do here, one more interview to do from QSC this year. It'll be up in just a minute. You're watching Techstrong TV.
welcome to another exciting episode of From the Source with your hosts, me, Ilkka Turnen.
Hi, and I'm Brian Fox.
And Brian's had a haircut.
I did, but I have your favorite all-day DevOps hat here somewhere, just in case I need it.
I still haven't received mine. But I'm glad that we've kind of moved past the hat wearing stage, and we've got to the fresh buzz over here. Well, hey Brian, we've got a pretty interesting episode today. I feel like we're kind of in our comfort zone today because today's topic is to do a deep dive on the latest State of the Software Supply Chain report. So I think a lot of people might not know what that is. So why don't you tell us sort of what the report is and kind of what sort of info we usually publish in it?
Yeah, sure. So this is our 10th year of doing what we call the Sonatype State of the Software Supply Chain report. And Sonatype, we run the Maven Central Repository, which is the repository where all the world's open source Java components are sourced. And that provides really unique visibility into what's going on inside of the ecosystem. Which versions are popular, which ones aren't, which ones are being updated, which ones aren't. Geographic trends, time trends, all kinds of stuff. We can do really deep research on there. And we pair that up also with our Nexus open source telemetry. We have like 150,000 instances of Nexus open source out in the world. Those instances are proxying NPM for JavaScript, PyPI for Python, Ruby gems, NuGet for .NET, Docker Hub, and Crates and Conan, and the list goes on. And so that provides us a pretty wide visibility into what's going on inside of the other ecosystems besides Java. And we use this data. We often also do surveys. Sometimes we do partnerships. This time we did a couple partnerships with different orgs to pull in different pieces of data and try to look at what's going on in the industry. And each year we tend to take a different look at what's going on. So it's not like the same report just updated every year. We do new and novel types of research every single time to try to understand things like, why aren't people fixing dependency vulnerabilities, or, what's going on with malware, efficient algorithms for detecting whether a project has high quality or not, looking at their behavior. So there's a lot of different things over the last decade that we've looked at, but that's generally what the report is all about.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because over the sort of last 10 years, we've been looking at so many different facets that it feels to me like I'm still talking about a couple of research points from like a report 3 years ago, because it's still very relevant to what people are doing right now. And sort of the lessons sometimes get a little forgotten, and sometimes it's actually interesting also to take a couple of years of gap and take a look at if things have changed. Like in this year's report, there's a couple of items that we sort of refreshed, and having a sort of corpus of that long data, it really kind of gives you a perspective of how things have changed or not changed at all. So it's a very interesting read, and actually, kind of a lot of sort of nuggets of information when you take them individually, kind of make you go, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. Like for example, if we start from the very, very top, sort of the first big thing that we reveal in the report is open source adoption kind of sits at sort of a multi-trillion request scale now. I think we estimate about 6.6 trillion total downloads, and the bulk of that is formed of JavaScript and Java, the ecosystem. So I think together those already get to about the 6 trillion request count. But aside from that, kind of the biggest ecosystem that's growing, surprise, surprise, is Python. And can you guess?
How do you think that is? Anything interesting happen in Python land this year?
Yeah, let's think back. Chat LLMs, generative anything.
This AI thing.
Yeah. This whole AI boom. I'm sure it's old hat now, old news, but an incredible amount of sort of software supply chain infrastructure has been formed around not just the LLMs themselves, but also all the tokenizers, all the inference work that goes into training models is basically distributed as Python packages, is distributed through these software ecosystems. So actually Python's just like done a double whammy of it's the most popular programming language now on the planet, at least according to TOB and GitHub, and now it's also boosted by AI, so it's really rocketing quite heavily.
Yeah, it is. It's not unexpected, but it is interesting to see the massive growth there. I mean, JavaScript has always been the one with the most modules, most consumption, just merely because the individual pieces are so much smaller. In a Java world, it's like, imagine if each class was its own module, you'd have 10, 100x. That's kind of what happens in JavaScript. But the C Python kind of trending along similar numbers is a huge step forward for sure.
It just shows you that the march of open source has not stopped. I mean, the growth rate's 40% year over year or something like that, right?
Yeah. Every year, it looks the same every year, like it hasn't changed. Yeah.
Well, in fact, this year's number, if you look at the diagram, it's actually show up even sort of sharper than it's been before. So yeah, if anything, it's speeding up.
Yeah. Yeah. The usage is like a fractal. The more we look at it, the more we zoom out, the shape, the growth curve looks the same. Yeah.
Yeah. But obviously, sort of the next item in there is that there's also the sort of the underside of this. And this actually came out. I had a couple of chats on Blue Sky, which is where tech Twitter has now migrated to, apparently flown up. And there was an article actually written about this report, and it kind of really honed in on the risk side. And I think it's important that we understand the risk side as well. And that's something I really enjoyed in this year's report, was to sort of seeing the evolution of how these things started from sort of named exploits in the early 2010s and all of that to sort of the situation that we're in right now.
Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to do this year, given it was the 10-year anniversary, is really, do a look back over the different things that we've investigated over the years, refresh things that we haven't looked at in a while, and also just kind of take in how the industry has changed in those 10 years. And, 10 years doesn't seem like a lot. We founded Sonatype 17 years ago. So 10 years is, a little bit more than half. But we were well down the path of doing, what the world would now refer to as software composition analysis in 2014. We were several years into it at that point. But it was still interesting to look back and see how early and how much things have changed on the attacker side, right? And so, what I did when I looked at the 10 years, I kind of sat down and said, okay, we've got the attackers, we've got the open source publishers, we've got the consumers of open source, and then we've got the regulators. And what has everybody done in those 10 years? And unfortunately, the attackers have made the most progress, right? So 10 years ago was one of the first big struts vulnerabilities. Not the Equifax one. That wouldn't come for another 3 years at that point. But it was a smaller one that didn't get as much notoriety outside of at least the financial sector. And the financial sector was using struts a lot back then. And so there was this vulnerability, and, it was properly zero-day processed. It was disclosed responsibly, fixed, announced. And then it was days to weeks after that announcement was when the attackers jumped on it, right? And I know this firsthand from some of the mailing lists that I have access to, that I could see, in fact, that was happening. This wasn't a case that it was really being massively exploited before the disclosure, it came after. And so, one of the big dramatic shifts, old presentations I had at the time was highlighting the difference between, a fairly recent IBM report, at that time that was showing that attacks came, weeks to months following these disclosures. But in this case, it was a dramatic escalation to days. And Anonymous was making a name for themselves around this time. And so big banks, everybody suddenly had maintenance all at the same time, right? So read between the lines, if you will, but nobody raised their hand, nobody got hauled before Congress, nobody really got fired over this, but it was one of the early shots across the bow. That same sort of cluster of years, we also saw Shell Shock and Heartbleed, right? These were two very widespread open source security issues. Not so much open source components in the way that we tend to focus on them at Sonatype, like struts, like Log4j, but definitely open source in general. And because of the widespread nature of those, they did get some attention. They had logos, they had names, they were celebrity vulnerabilities, like we refer to them these days. But then not a lot changed. It kind of went back. We regressed to the mean. Fast forward a few years, the Equifax breach happened. That was announced to be, caused by a different Struts vulnerability. The difference there was they were pretty open about it, but then there were congressional hearings, and C-suite lost their jobs over some of these things, and it was another awakening of people starting to pay attention to what's going on. Around that same time, however, I saw and started writing about this rise of intentionally malicious components, and components whose attacks were designed not to go after the end user of the software, but actually trying to steal things from open source publishers. Credentials to publish into these public repositories were in fact the target. And I remember thinking, why is nobody talking about this? This is a dramatic shift in the attack mechanism. And, we've been talking about that for now 7 years. And I think it's still something people struggle with. They don't recognize this threat.
There was literally one this week where a video player component had their, I think it's called Llama Player, got their author credentials stolen, and somebody literally went on NPM and published a couple of malicious versions. And what it did was, if you had it embedded on your website, because a lot of people have it on CDNs, it actually just displayed hey, connect your crypto wallet to this website type of situation, like log in with your crypto wallet. And if you'd done that, you would have just stolen your crypto. So yeah, unfortunately, people struggle with it.
So silly, That's exactly what I expect if I'm watching an embedded video. Of course, it makes sense for me to enter my crypto credentials, but the point is, they do these things because they work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, point, isn't it? Is that what often gets lost in this discussion is that even if we've said it, even if it's been said 5 years ago, and it feels like a very blasé risk, it's still a risk.
Still
in fact, if anything, those things are happening more.
That's right. So that is continuing to explode. We're going to get to that exact number in a second, but continuing the evolution of these attacks, what finally I think got regulators and the industry in general sitting up was sort of two rapid fire things in back-to-back years. The first was SolarWinds, which was not really a component-based attack, but it definitely had elements, I think it's fair to call it a supply chain attack, right?
For sure.
Where malicious code was embedded into the SolarWinds product that then got distributed downstream. That was a bit traditional. The end user was the target in that instance. But certainly government was heavily affected by this as users, and that really started getting people to pay attention. And then before, the news cycle moved on and everybody went back to the mean, then we had Log4Shell, right? And that I think finally got regulators and everybody sitting up and kind of looking at this challenge. As we'll talk about, it wasn't awesome in all of the instances, but it definitely finally, I think, broke through. And if you're thinking about that timeline, that's like 7 years from some of these early ones till it became really, really prevalent. And then the other kind of bellwether thing that happened this year was this attempted attack on XZutils, which is a compression library used in Linux distributions. This was, a several year long attack to get access to a single maintainer project. They created meaningful code. They created very sophisticated backdoor tech. If you haven't looked into it and you like code, you should definitely look into it. The way they hid that in plain sight is in some levels fascinating, right?
I mean, it's genius if it wasn't evil. That's
right. It was very fascinating to see that, and it was a near miss. And so I predict that this one will be like that first Struts thing. It's the thing that happened, and most people forget it happened some number of years from now, when finally these things happen enough times that it becomes the norm. Because I think XZutil scared a lot of people, but I feel like the conversation has moved on back to the basics, and this problem didn't go away. There's 0% chance that the attackers, having gained access to a project 2 years ago, just stopped at one. Because they had 2 years to gain access to others before they attempted the attack. So it just logically makes zero sense that would be the case. So we have to assume that there are more out there, and we just don't know about it yet.
Yeah, I think it was the OpenJS Foundation put out a press release a couple of months after, where they actually said that they found some traces of evidence of sort of similar psyops, where the maintainers started getting these sort of very.
I've seen the emails. I helped connect the dots on that one. It was basically the same. They made more mistakes, so it feels like they farmed it out to junior engineers to try to replicate. But that also happened. That happened within the last year. It was very recent at the time we discovered it. So there was still a 2-year gap between that first of takeover and this other failed attempted takeover. What's happened in between by the ones that got it right the first time? That part, I think that story is still being written.
Often when we tell the stories like this, people kind of get stuck on the fact of, hey, that's one example. But where there's smoke, there's usually some fire, and one of those sort of key things that we see is we kind of keep track of when we see a malware incident, like something that is malicious in nature, either these takeovers or somebody outright publishing malware or things that we consider malicious. And we kind of publish a number on that every year. And this year it actually hit just over 700,000. And I think you were saying to me yesterday that it's probably closer to 800,000 by this stage.
Yeah, by now this stat, because we were writing the report over the summer, the stat's a few months old already. So we're probably closer to 800. Yeah, but it was 250,000-ish at this time in last year's report. So now we're at 700,000, and this continues to explode. We were seeing 600, 700% growth in early years on small numbers, but the fact that it doubled last year and it doubled again this year on much bigger numbers is significant. And I'll take the moment to point out right now, we did some other research in a different part of the report this year. There's about 7 million components out there in the popular open source ecosystems. Some of the research we did was to find out which ones are actively being downloaded, which ones are actively being used in applications. It's about 10% of that. 10% of that is 700,000. That's about the same number of these intentionally malicious components that we've tracked over the last handful of years. That's pretty striking when you think about it. When you think that as we sit here right now, we're probably already in a place where there have been more fake malicious components published to NPM and Python and some of those ecosystems than exist in popular components in all of the ecosystems combined. So from a developer perspective, the signal to noise ratio is going in the wrong direction.
That is a pretty profound and pretty alarming thing when you think about it. I mean, the counter argument to that has always been, well, we know which projects are good and we will stick to that. But increasingly, when we looked at the makeup of the types of malware that we actually saw, I mean, a couple of things that really stood out to me was about half of it is sort of what we would class as, well, not quite half, 40% is what we would class as sort of potentially unwanted features, and which is just packages doing stuff that they don't tell you that they do, which can range from just protestware, things like, hey, I don't want to do this for free, anti-work protest type stuff, to more malicious stuff like a little bit more advanced protests that actually delete your files if you've got certain keyboards on your system, to where we start getting to much more serious type of malware being distributed, being pushed out. We've even seen cases, this exit key case was like the most genius because it was very bespoke. It was hidden over 2 years. It was encrypted. It was hidden in the file encryption sample files, which is just, clever, evil, but clever. But you do see a fair amount of malware that, for example, steals environmental secrets, steals authentication tokens, steals developer environments. And the more that we've looked at it, it actually fits really well into the sort of standard criminal ecosystem. So the National Cybersecurity Center here in the UK published a killer of an article a couple of years ago where they spoke about how the ransomware ecosystem works, where we've got these, gangs that gain initial access, and they do it by distributing malware. Then they kind of bundle that access, like, hey, here's 100 machines from Bank X onto these affiliate marketplaces, and then they get picked up by actual ransomware gangs or criminal gangs that then do the thing, which might be dropping ransomware, stealing secrets, executing other sort of subsequent attacks over there. And what's sort of been chilling is the types of malware that we discover, especially the really, really serious stuff, is stuff directly connected to that criminal ecosystem. So it's clear that it's not just individual operators kind of doing proof of concept packages. It's fairly organized stuff.
Right.
You see there. The sort of inflation of that just shows that that the growth of that number is growing way faster than the growth of open source consumption itself, which kind of tells you that the bad guys are really adopting it at scale. Which isn't to say
it's working, and it's working because we don't have good defenses around it, right? So the way you manage your typical vulnerabilities is very different here. Right, a vulnerability is a bug that may or may not be exploited. These malicious targets, they execute as soon as a developer downloads it, because these ecosystems execute things. So that's part of the challenge. You need to defend against it up front. We've been building solutions for this for a long time because, frankly, back in 2017, I started talking about this, and I had some, customers, audience members come up and say, Brian, how do you help with this? And I didn't have a great answer, honestly, because it was a very different dimension to the problem. So we sought out to build a solution for this. And this is how we've been catching all of these malicious components for all these number of years. So definitely there is a way to solve this problem. But I think many people want to think about it like vulnerabilities. And, I did some stuff on LinkedIn earlier this year trying to play with some analogies. And, I think the one that sticks is more of a food-based thing. Like food might go bad, might spoil, right? And that could be considered a vulnerability. A piece of moldy cheese, for example, you might cut the mold out and eat around it. Like that's a thing, right? Or bread.
Milk that goes bad and curdles.
That's right. But in this instance, you might look at it and you cut out the bad piece, but you wouldn't do that if the food was poisoned, right? It's a very different thing. You don't look at, if I told you one of your devices had an explosive in it, you wouldn't say, it's okay, I'm going to update my software next week. Throw it out the window, get away from it. And so, the malicious element of this, I think, gets caught up in organizations that are struggling to deal with the massive amount of vulnerabilities that are out there. And it's unfortunate because it is a very important thing. It needs to be dealt with separately. And as we're seeing with the rise here, not enough people are. So let's hop ahead a little bit. We're running out of time a little bit, but we also looked at publishers. The open source publishers and what happened in the last 10 years. And just quickly, I'll say, unsurprisingly, we've seen that, 1,400% of them are releasing much more faster year over year. That's not surprising. But what is surprising is the time it takes them to remediate their own dependency vulnerabilities has gone from days and weeks to, on average, 300 days. Right. And part of this is caused by this massive rise of vulnerabilities that are out there. The number of CVEs is skyrocketing, just like the malicious components. And certainly open source maintainers are struggling to keep up, right? So they've reported in surveys that they're spending 3 times more time dealing with these reports, dealing with vulnerabilities, and yet they're still taking on average 300 days to get to them in most of these cases. The good news is we found when we broke it down by organizations or projects that have foundation support, or foundations that have that are being the maintainers are being paid, they have significantly better outcomes. 3 times better outcomes in some dimensions, 7 times better outcomes in other dimensions. So there is a glimmer of hope that if we're able to help better support the open source maintainers, they demonstrably do a better job at producing safer components that everybody is relying on, right? So we need to be able to focus on that a little bit going forward, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, one of the findings that we had, I think, a year ago or 2 years ago, is generally open source projects are better than industry at taking these fixes and actually applying them. Often the conversation is about the maintainer struggling. That's absolutely a true conversation. But even cases like Log4Shell, they made the fix in like 10 days. Which is
less than that on a holiday weekend, no less. Thanksgiving, yeah.
Exactly. So if you compare that to what would happen in an enterprise or in a closed source setting, it probably would be a very different story. Yeah. So part of often when I look at these sort of numbers, it's really a symptom of the success of open source itself. Like there's just so much of it, and it's so networked with one another that creates that complexity, and the projects are just like inundated basically with this stuff as a result.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people look at the conversation. I think this is the article you were referring to before, looking at, highlighting of risk in open source and saying, yeah, but making the false straw man argument that we're trying to say it's worse than commercial. I don't think it is in most cases, but it's certainly easier to observe. And I think the problem lies in the fact that organizations often are making these choices around open source. Well, frankly, the organization is not making the choice. A developer or group of developers are making these choices. They can often be uninformed, and the organizations don't have your typical procurement processes in place to be able to vet and recognize and track and update open source components like they do with the software that they purchase. Right. So while probably open source on average actually does a better job at this because of the way it's procured sort of at the bottom level in development, and without the transparency, the way the organization manages it leads to potentially worse outcomes than what you see inside of commercial software. And I think that's the nuance. It's a little bit hard sometimes for people that want to build those straw man arguments to really see through the noise there.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, it's often well-intentioned too, but the problem is because there's just so much of it and there's so little visibility and sort of shared and standards, if you will, that doesn't happen. And that's part of the reason, actually. One chapter, we don't have time to like super deep dive into it, but the last sort of piece that we did in there was take a look at sort of the regulations that are rising as a result. So all of this is for better or for worse. No sort of judgment on the validity of necessity of these.
Yeah, I do want to hit on the consumer one. The last 3 years we've calculated this number, and so we looked at when something is being downloaded from a public repository and it already has a known vulnerability. Is that happening because open source hasn't fixed it yet, or is it happening because the open source consumer hasn't made a better choice? 96% of the time, it's the latter. Only 4% of the time is something consumed with a known vulnerability that isn't already fixed. And unfortunately, in the last 3 years, that statistic has not changed. It's 96% of the time for the last 3 years, right? And the other one that we've reported on a lot is, the percentage of vulnerable Log4j downloads at any given rate. Last year we were at about 30%. We're finally to 13% this year. But look, it took 3 years for the most notorious, most widely documented, discussed, the issue that was on the top 10 list for the NSA's nation state attack exploits for 3 years. And it took us 3 years to get to the point where 77% of the choices are the right ones now. That's still pretty terrible, right? And this is I think, where we see this year after year, is that all these things are happening. The discussion tends to go towards, we need to help open source. Maybe we shouldn't use so much open source. And like I said, we should help open source. The numbers get better when you do. But 96% of the time, the problem is the organization consuming the open source hasn't updated their software. So we can do all these other things, and we should do them. But until the consumers fix their behaviors, we're playing in the margins of that 4% of the behavior, right? And that's the problem that I keep trying to shine a light on. And I think, frankly, this is why the regulators have stepped in, because the things, I think it's a lack of motivation. It's not an understanding in most of these cases, right? And so we did an episode, I think it was last time already, where we went deep on the regulation. So if you haven't seen that, you should go back and take a look at that. But I think, there's a little bit of good news that we're finally getting some regulation after, 15 years of shouting from the mountaintop and not seeing things change. I think some of these incoming regulations, the European Union's Cyber Resiliency Act, the Product Liability Directive in Europe, I think will be game changers. The PCI 4 standards that are coming out, that they've come out, but they will take effect, I believe, in March of 25. Those have elements in it that are similar. They require software bills of materials, things like that. I think those things will finally start to move the industry in the right direction. It's very slow right now, but I think at least we've turned the corner, and the right attention is being paid on these things.
Yeah, and that's the path that I think is a good place for us to wrap up today's episode as well. I think the SBOM adoption itself, I mean, in itself, it's a little bit of a controversial subject depending a little bit where you're looking at it. But whether or not we like it or not, it's just become a requirement for all the reasons above. And so it'll be interesting. We do take a little bit of track on how projects are starting to publish SBOMs and what sort of level they're at. So definitely worth the read if you want to kind of look at the data there. But hey, Brian, I think
we're going to get the report. Sonatype.com/SSCR.
Sonatype.com/SSCR. There's a very handy dandy QR code we can attach to this as well. So with that, thanks very much. I'll talk to you next time.
SecurityBoulevard.com is the leading resource for news, analysis, and education on challenges facing the cybersecurity industry. SecurityBoulevard.com covers all aspects of cybersecurity, including data security, DevSecOps, cloud security, application security, network security, security threats, and more. SecurityBoulevard.com has the largest selection of security content, featuring breaking news, blog posts, podcasts, and more. Visit www.securityboulevard.com to learn more. SecurityBoulevard.com, home of Security Bloggers Network.
This is Techstrong TV.
Hey guys, thanks for the throw. We're here with Brian Fox, who's the CTO for Sonatype, and Donald Fisher, who's CEO for TideLift. And each of them has been doing a little bit of work in the space of studying what it is that open source maintainers are challenged by when it comes to securing their software supply chains and all the vulnerabilities they got to deal with. Brian, Donald, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having us.
All right, let's start with Brian a little bit. I think maybe this whole conversation needs to start with a little empathy. Not all of these open source maintainers are paid for their efforts, and a lot of it is a labor of love, and they're not exactly on call every time there's an issue. And so how should organizations that are dependent upon open source software kind of think about or approach these folks when it comes to security?
That's a very meaty topic. If we back it up a little bit, I think yes, empathy is an important part of this that I'd like to emphasize. In this year's State of the Software Supply Chain report, it was the 10th annual, and so we did sort of a look back. And one of the findings we found that relates to this topic was how long it takes open source projects to remediate vulnerabilities in their dependencies. And 10 years ago, it was something, I think it was about 17 days. Now it's 300 days on average, which is pretty terrible over that time. They've been releasing faster, which is great, but fixing these things slower on average, which is not great. But and this is where I always stop and point out, this is not an indictment of those maintainers. This is more of a cry for help, because what's going on at the same time, if you look at the number of the CVEs that have been reported in the world and against open source at large has also skyrocketed, right? At massive growth in the number of vulnerabilities. I'm looking at the chart now. In 2023, it was like 30,000, whereas 10 years ago, it was in the thousands per year, right? So, and I think, Donald, your survey found that the maintainers during this time are spending, significantly more time fixing the vulnerabilities and dealing with this. So it's not that they're not trying to, they're trying really hard and still, being pushed underwater. And I think that's where some of the findings from the TideLift report, other findings from our report kind of point in the right direction. Specifically, we looked at the projects that TideLift has supported. We looked at projects that our foundation supported, and we found that the paid maintainers, are doing a significantly better job than the average of addressing those vulnerabilities. Right. So, Donald, you have more specifics on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting because, Brian referenced the Sonatype State of the Open Source Supply Chain report there, which I kind of think of as a demand side view of this problem space. The Tidelift survey that we recently published is really from the supply side. It's focused on open source maintainers. We call it the State of the Open Source Maintainer Report. And we did find that maintainers are spending a lot more time on security work specifically than they did just a couple of years ago. So in fact, we found that maintainers report that they're spending almost 3 times as much time on security work than they were in our previous versions of this survey that we did in the last couple of years. Now, Brian referenced that their report found that commercially supported open source projects have better security hygiene, faster time to remediation. We also see that from the supply side when we look at the supply side. So specifically, we found when we ask open source maintainers, what specific security practices do you assure for your open source projects? We found that paid maintainers undertake a significantly higher number of those secure development practices than unpaid maintainers. Across the board, paid maintainers are 55% more likely to report that they're following critical security and maintenance practices, such as having multi-factor authentication enabled on all of the tools and systems they use to develop and publish their software, using code analysis tools to look for potential security vulnerabilities, having a security response policy published and a clear allocation of responsibilities for what happens if a security vulnerability comes up. So overall, maintainers are spending more energy on the security of our software supply chain, which is good. And the really good news, I think, is that paid maintainers are doing it even more to a higher standard. And that's great because that means we can pay more maintainers more money to do more of this. We have a way to influence the health and security of the open source commons that we depend on.
Just out of curiosity, Donald, how many maintainers are paid or want to get paid, and what's the challenge with paying?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is one of the things that we highlight in the Tidelift State of the Open Source Maintainer Report. It's a really key finding that is counterintuitive, I think, to a lot of people in the industry, which is that of the hundreds, we surveyed over 400 independent open source maintainers for this survey, and over 60% of them reported that they are unpaid. They do not receive any kind of compensation associated with their open source work. 25% of the maintainers reported that they're sort of a semi-professional maintainer. They're earning some income somewhere associated with their projects, and only 12% reported that they're a professional maintainer. Most of their income comes from their open source work. So a lot of folks just don't have that intuition, especially organizations that are consuming open source. They don't really realize, and they kind of assume, oh, maybe Google's paying for it or something, or there's a company around all these things. The majority of the widely used open source projects are looked after by unpaid maintainers. But there's a really cool opportunity here, which is the vast majority of those unpaid maintainers told us that they are interested in getting paid to spend more time doing more things around their open source projects. In fact, if you look at that 60% who report that they're unpaid, 44% of the total maintainer audience report that they're currently unpaid but would appreciate being paid for undertaking, for example, secure development practices for their projects. So again, opportunity, we can do this. All we have to do is, kind of act.
Brian, what is the challenge in actually getting the tools to these folks and maybe the training? I mean, we've been talking about this issue of making software developers in general more aware of security issues, but I feel like, sometimes it sticks, sometimes it doesn't. And what is the challenge here with getting these maintainers who are really developers in their own right, just more security conscious? Is that all there is to it? Or is there something more that needs to be done?
I mean, we in the software industry for the last 50 years, we've been trying to make engineers better at security. Full stop. Open source, commercial, irrelevant. And while I think that's helped, certainly, it's clearly not solving the problem. And, just more of the same, we should expect more of the same lack of results, right? And so I think there is a little bit of a lack of motivation on the consuming side of this that is driving some of these behaviors. So, and this is why I've been a proponent of, the software liability changes. We're finally seeing some of that in Europe, but I think there's a sort of a trickle down effect or a cyclical kind of relationship here, right? So if/when organizations are finally really held accountable for the choices that their developers are making in terms of the projects, the open source projects in this context, that they're using inside of the software that their company is selling, until that really becomes something that is significantly a risk for the business in terms of a major lawsuit, we're going to see the same thing. And so when those organizations make those better choices, then I think you will start to see open source projects actually caring about that. Right now, I can create an open source thing. If it provides a little bit of value, I throw it out there, millions of people might use it. In some future state where that won't be successful unless I follow some of the steps that Donald's projects lay out, that I can attest that I'm doing things securely and that, I'm following all the practices, my project won't get traction. So in other words, the natural evolution of that will come only when the consuming organizations are basically using that to select better projects. There will be a natural selection, in other words, of those behaviors. I just don't see anything that's going to change the game. It's not a lack of knowledge. Most open source maintainers these days understand that they should be doing it. They're not getting the support, sometimes the tools and the infrastructure required to actually do these practices. They're not free. Somebody's paying for them somewhere, right? And so, so I think that's part of the problem here, that we can't just tell everybody do better. Frankly, we've been doing that for 50 years and it's not better.
Yeah.
And also, by the way, when those organizations are on the hook to actually think about that, suddenly, paying the maintainers a little bit of money sounds like a tremendous amount of value. I'm looking here at the statistic. This comes from Harvard Business School. They estimated that the open source produces, about between $4 billion on the supply side and $8 trillion of economic value on the sales side of this. So in other words, the open source infrastructure that is being created and shared leads to an $8 trillion economic outcome. Why can't we peel off like a fraction of a percent of that to help support those very people? When that happens, these things will get solved. Until then, I think it's an uphill battle.
Yeah, and we have some, from the Tidelift, looking at it from the supply side, from the maintainer's perspective, I already shared that maintainers report that they're spending 3 times as much time now than in years past on security-related tasks. So some of that message is starting to come through from the demand side, the organizations that are using their software. We also polled maintainers specifically on their familiarity with specific secure development standards or regimes. And we did find a notable increase in awareness among open source maintainers of standards such as the US government promoted NIST Secure Software Development Framework. Last year, when we did our maintainer survey, only 26% of maintainers were familiar with the NIST SSDF, whereas this year, 2024, 39%, 26 to 39. So a big swing in awareness there. We also asked about an industry initiative around open source software security practices coming from the OpenSSF, the group of industry participants around open source security. And from last year to this year, we saw an increase in awareness from 28% to 48% among maintainers in the OpenSSF scorecard, their sort of rubric for secure development practices. And the number of maintainers who reported they had heard of none of these secure development standards went down from 52% last year to 40% this year. So I think that's a sign of green shoots. There is some not only opportunity, but we're starting to make some progress connecting the needs of the organizations that build with open source to the creators of open source, even if they're not traditional companies or even foundations. And just a point on that last one, one of the things that we found is that we re-verified that the vast majority of open source maintainers report that they are solo maintainers. They don't work for a company with a bunch of colleagues. They don't even have a bunch of open source maintainers. The majority of open source maintainers that we spoke to are single maintainers of their projects. They're, N of one looking after each of these essential projects. Yeah.
So, Brian, about once a year or so, there's this, moment of panic when some 0-day vulnerability thing gets discovered and everybody goes running for cover. Do we need some sort of standby SWAT team that's available to help these maintainers when those issues arise? Or is there some other way to think about this? Because it seems like that army of one is quickly overwhelmed whenever there's a crisis.
No, I don't think so. I think I strongly believe, and don't have the data immediately at my fingertips to prove it, but that most open source responds quicker than commercial open source. I mean, than commercial code companies in terms of turning these things around. I mean, Log4Shell is a really perfect example that highlights this, right? That team turned around the vulnerability when it was irresponsibly disclosed in Asia over a holiday weekend, right? They fixed it in days. But I know you and I have talked about the uptake of the fixed versions of Log4j over the last 4 years. This year, we reported we're down to 13%. So 13% of the time, organizations are still downloading the vulnerable versions of Log4j as of a couple months ago. Last year, it was 30%, right? And so we're talking about the most high profile, most discussed. The vulnerability was on the top 10 nation state attack vector list for the last 10 years. And consuming organizations are still pulling it down in a non-trivial amount. And it took them 3 years. Like I said, last year it was still 1/3. And so the fact that the project team turned that around and fixed it within days is awesome. And yet the impact lingers, right? The long tail of the updates. And so we looked at enterprise software. We found that on average, 80% of dependencies are unupdated year over year. We've also found that for the last 3 years, this statistic has not changed. 96% of the time when something is being downloaded and included in a build that has a known vulnerability, it's already been fixed. So only 4% of the time are consuming organizations, including components, where they have no choice because the open source hasn't fixed it, right? So all these things have to happen simultaneously. We need to be able to, of course, support open source, help them respond to these things. It's only going to get worse when the legislation comes because the demands on open source are going to get higher. So they definitely need help there. But the real problem at the moment is still consuming organizations, by and large, are doing a terrible job of managing their supply chain, full stop, right? That's why we started writing this report 10 years ago. And while many dimensions are improving, it's clearly not improving fast enough. It's not improving as fast as the attackers are, certainly. And I think that is the reason why we're starting to see regulators worldwide step in, because the organizations, the industry has not appropriately responded. So I think that's where the problem largely lies.
Right. Donald, to Brian's point about that, the maintainers will say, I did all the right things. It's all these other folks that keep downloading the wrong version of these things, and it's not my fault. So how do we kind of bridge this gap?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple elements to the solution, and this is a large part of our focus at Tidelift is how do we bridge the interests of these organizations that are consuming all of this and those open source creators who typically didn't start their open source projects because they wanted to become part of the software supply chain of large organizations, but they've wound up in that circumstance, right? So I think one element is agreeing on what good is. And I think there's a positive development with these standards that we talked about before, government standards like the NIST Secure Software Development Framework, industry standards like the OpenSSF scorecard. They're literal checklists of, okay, here are the things that we want to have done for the open source software that we consume. It makes it very concrete. It's a clear ask to the open source maintainers. But I think we've found now, we've verified as an industry that just asking is not enough because there's a cost to doing it. Brian referenced this, right? So a simple capitalistic way that we can approach this problem is if we're making an ask that's not free of cost, but not tremendously difficult to get done, let us bring an economic exchange into the picture and say, here's the list of things that we want you to do. And back to something you said, Mike. First of all, there's no appreciation here, so thank you for doing what you've already done, and we want you to go above and beyond that. So how about we can pay you this much money? Maybe it's not a new full-time job, but it's some non-trivial income on the side in exchange for going and undertaking this list of secure development practices or other improvements to your software that you otherwise wouldn't do for free. And we've seen tremendous success with that model over the last couple of years at TideLift, starting with just saying thank you and then making a clear ask, providing some financial incentive. I think of it as like a nudge, just to kind of like give you a little excuse to go the extra mile on this stuff. But the impact to organizations that consume this software is tremendous because they can get a clean bill of health across that entire, standardized checklist. And that's really what they need to understand what they're building their software applications out of.
Brian, is it always cash that people want, or are there other ways of driving compensation? Because when I get cash, then I got to fill out tax forms and all this other stuff. So are there other ways to think about compensating folks?
I don't know that I have the answer to that question. Cash certainly complicates it. And Donald probably has some thoughts here, but certainly help is going to be required, right? Help can come in many forms. In a single maintainer project, cash to turn, that pet project that is a nuisance into an actual side hustle is clearly, demonstrably, based on our data, useful. I think in other cases, especially as we start to see more stringent requirements coming, the Cyber Resiliency Act and things like that in Europe, we're going to see first, potentially tone deaf requests from big organizations emailing the open source maintainers as they would a vendor demanding they fill out a survey. And that's going to get them nowhere. But showing up and actually helping to create the documentation, helping or providing resources, people, employees to help with some of these things, or maybe even infrastructure or donating tool licenses to help, all of those things are required, and they all happen a little bit. But there's many ways that organizations can, let's just say, invest in the open source that they're dependent upon, and they can take many of those different forms.
Yeah. Donald, last thoughts on that?
We have data on this again from our survey. So we just straight up asked open source maintainers, we know there's a lot of good aspects of being an open source maintainer, but what do you dislike about being an open source maintainer? And the top three things that they reported, number one is not being financially compensated enough for their work. Number two is feeling underappreciated or like the work is thankless. And number three is it adds to my personal stress. So I do think that they are telling us the answer here, which is that, money actually is a significant portion of this, but it's not all money. I mean, number two is they feel underappreciated. I think it's also appropriate for us to find ways to say thank you and demonstrate our gratitude to open source creators. And then around the third one, adds to my personal stress. I think that's where you get some of this, how can we help share the load? How can we provide tools, as Brian was talking about? How can we offer, for those solo maintainer projects, how can we contribute organizational support of a new co-maintainer or help, resolve some of those requests? But the number one solution that maintainers are proposing when we ask them this question, or the number one pain they're looking to address, is that a lot of folks are making a ton of money using their open source projects and assuming that they're going to do all of this work to bring it to the enterprise grade, and they're not getting credited in on any of it. And that's a really straightforward one for us to be able to solve now.
All right, folks, you heard it here. One, open source maintainers, no matter what you may believe, are not standing by waiting for your phone call. And two, compensation still drives behavior. Hey, Brian, Donald, thanks for being on the show.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right. And back to you guys in the studio.
Rackspace's illogical hack, hurricane hurts the hurts, unlimited power, Nginx 1 launches, NIST comes out with some new password policies, and we're going to do an AI security roundup in this episode of the Gestalt IT Rundown. Hello, everyone out there. It is October 2nd, which means it is officially spooky season. It's also National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and there's no better group to get your cybersecurity awareness news from than us here at the Rundown. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and on this National Smarties Day, I am joined by a smarty and one of our favorite Tech Field Day delegates, Mr. Jack Pollard. Jack, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here today.
Well, we're very excited to have you here. We've got a fun little group of stories that we've been scouring the internet for. That's been a busy week in news, but we're going to go ahead and jump right in. So, Jack, take it away.
So, hosting provider Rackspace realized they had a problem on their hands when one of their third-party tools was exploited to gain access to monitoring servers. While they didn't name the tool, it was later determined that a component of Science Logic was at fault. The self-hosted install fell victim to a zero-day exploit that doesn't currently have a CVE attached. Rackspace quickly took the interface offline to mitigate the damage. When pressed, Science Logic didn't disclose anything had happened or which tool was at risk to prevent further exploitation. Tom, that's pretty bad, isn't it?
It is. And I kind of, it's one of those things where you kind of have to empathize with Rackspace here because they have to monitor all their systems somehow, right? So they went with what is considered by most people to be an industry-leading tool. The problem, of course, is that nobody is immune from a zero-day. And what happened here is that attackers were able to get a hold of a really good one that had no kind of notifications whatsoever. We don't even know how they got in right now. All we know is that, what we assume is that it was Science Logic that allowed them in. Because you know how when companies are real cagey about saying what it was, but what it wasn't, and we can't do this, and we can't do that, they really only have one big system that they use to monitor. And when they said it was a monitoring system, the register was like, oh, we know what that is. So they reached out to Science Logic. And of course, Science Logic, wanting to save face, but also be able to protect their other customers, was like, oh, no, we're not going to say anything because it could impact future things. Mum's the word. Don't tell anybody. I think what's going to happen is that once Rackspace gets done pulling this thing apart, we're going to get a proper CVE for it, which means that we're going to be able to take care of it. The other thing is Rackspace would really like you to know that while they did take the interface to work on the dashboard offline so that nobody could get to it, they were still monitoring all of your stuff, which means, of course, you still have to pay your bills. But I think we're going to start seeing more and more of these kinds of things. For something like this to have been targeted so efficiently, and for it to have been a completely unknown zero day with no news or notifications at all, that tends to lead more towards the professional and or sponsored scene, where they're really looking to gain footholds into these monitoring systems to be able to leverage that data for either future attempts to hack providers or good old-fashioned extortion with lots and lots of data. I'm starting to lean more toward foothold simply because the extortion path seems to be kind of drying up a little bit, as we saw in the news a couple of weeks ago when Fortinet got hacked and they refused to pay the ransom. So the guy's just like, whatever, I'm going to release the data. I think for something like this, the data is not what's critical. It's what you can do with it. And it's worthless to Rackspace, right? I'm going to tell you the up-down stats on a whole bunch of interfaces. I think it's more important that they prevent these things from being areas where people can kind of slide in and persist for, years in some cases. So good on you, Rackspace, for fixing this. Just make sure we're getting a little bit better disclosures next time. All right, Jack, there were some devastating floods in North Carolina this week due to a hurricane, and the town of Spruce Pine was affected. Now, you may not know what Spruce Pine is, but it's one of the only sources of pure quartz in America, and that could threaten the supply chain for a lot of microchips and solar panels. The town produces ultra-high quality quartz that's essential for manufacturing semiconductors. Experts have warned that prolonged disruption due to flooding and other damage could have far-reaching consequences. Now, of course, we've been glued to the news watching all of the recovery efforts that have been going on so far. The world is kind of holding its breath, and we're a little bit curious to make sure that the people in in spruce pine are safe, but also how that could affect the quartz mines and what we've seen so far with even minor supply chain disruptions, how the ripple effects can last for years. So, Jack, I mean, are you worried that the spruce pine quartz mines are going to be adversely affected?
Yeah, well, yes and no. Right now, it's not clear. We just don't have enough information on whether the mine is affected. But we do know that the town of Spruce Pine, along with hundreds of other little tiny towns in the mountains of Western North Carolina, have been affected by the storm. Now, ironically, I was actually planning on going out vacation to see the fall leaves change in 2 weeks and had an Airbnb reservation in the town of Spruce Pine. So this is sort of near and dear to my heart. What I've been able to determine so far is that there are many different two-lane roads that cross the tiny rivers there, and a lot of the bridges have been washed out. So the mines are serviced only by two-lane blacktop, and it's going to be hard, if not impossible, to get stuff to and from the mines for at least a few weeks, if not months, while everything gets rebuilt. Now, where this becomes critical is what the mines are producing and what they're used for. And they produce what we call high purity quartz, which is 99.999% pure or better. So basically a few parts per billion of impurities. And why this is important is we use those quartz to create a crucible or a container for holding molten silicon as you grow a silicon wafer, or actually a silicon ingot. So to create a microchip, first you have to create pure silicon. And again, the silicon you want to be 99.999% pure or better, because any impurity affects the electrical properties of the silicon and can cause your chip to go bad. So you create a crystal of silicon in a crucible and you grow that to something on the order of 2 meters or about 6 feet in length by about a foot or more in diameter. And these things weigh a couple hundred pounds, 300 to 500 pounds. And then you slice those into wafers that are less than a millimeter thick. And that becomes the base for every chip manufactured. And right now, the mines that are run by a company called Sibelco produce almost all of the high purity quartz used in growing crystals, silicon crystals for semiconductor manufacturing, actually worldwide. So this could be a very big problem that affects the supply chain in semiconductors. It will also affect the supply chain and the cost for solar panels. And as we transition from coal and natural gas to solar and wind energy, this is going to make the cost of energy much more expensive. So we have a supply chain issue, we have an energy problem, and it's really going to be a challenge to see how this affects the semiconductor industry. And that's not to say that we've ignored the people and that are being affected in the area. There's, over 150 deaths already and more deaths. And so my heart goes out to all the people in Spruce Pine and all of Western North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee. This has just been a really bad situation all around. The rapidly growing demands of artificial intelligence are sparking a new era in nuclear energy as tech giants and U.S. government join forces to meet the power-hungry needs of AI data centers. With AI's insatiable thirst for energy driving a surge in electricity demand, major players like Microsoft and Google are turning to nuclear power as clean energy, as a clean and reliable solution for energy. From restarting dormant reactors to investing in cutting-edge nuclear technology, the AI revolution is breathing new life into the U.S. nuclear energy sector. And again, with the hurricane affecting the Spruce Pine mine and affecting the availability of solar panels, I think the energy sector is really going to change. What can you tell us about this?
I think it's interesting that we've started to kind of dust off the old standards, if you will. to kind of look at what we're doing. I am a huge proponent of clean energy. I love the idea of solar. I live in Oklahoma, so wind is not a problem for us. I mean, there's these gigantic complexes of windmills, and they are great to offset what we're currently using from our energy production. Like, you know how people were saying, oh, you know, we're going to have to worry about electric cars, and how are we going to manage to do that? Electric cars are a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of power that we're consuming with AI right now. Like, all you need to do is go look at the fact that a lot of those forward-looking sustainability statements that were put into these, prospectuses and things like that from large companies like Microsoft and Apple and others mysteriously disappeared in the last year or so. Not sure why. Could it have anything to do with the fact that they're spending billions upon billions of dollars doing AI research and consuming more power than your average Bitcoin mining operation? Might have something to do with it. But here's the thing that kills me, okay? So everybody have a seat, because this is kind of one of those whiplash moments. Nuclear power in the late 70s was a huge thing for the US, right? Like, we were building nuclear power plants as fast as we could do that. I know that because my dad was a general contractor on Vogel, Callaway, and Wolf Creek, which were nuclear power plants in Missouri, Georgia, and Kansas. My dad worked for Westinghouse when I was very little and was a very busy human being. But after Wolf Creek, I mean, there was one that they were working on in Michigan that I don't ever actually think that one opened. But interest tailed off because of a little thing called 3 Mile Island, where there was an incident, not an explosion like Chernobyl, an incident where some steam was released that was irradiated, right? Do you know how we found out that they're investigating new nuclear plants? Microsoft is restarting the reactors at 3 Mile Island. Irony, stop cutting so hard. Like, I get it, okay? Nuclear power plants are actually the perfect solution to this problem. And we had a story that we did earlier this year where Amazon was talking about using small-scale nuclear reactors to run data centers. Great idea. Nuclear power has everything that an AI supercluster needs. It is consistent. It is predictable. It does not need to have a lot of storage. Like, that's one of the problems with a wind farm. A wind farm creates power, and then you're kind of stuck, right? Like, you have to use it, or you have to store it, or you have to shunt it around the grid. If you've ever driven through an area with a lot of windmills, you'll notice that some of them are off a lot of the time. Partially it's due to maintenance reasons, but it's also because, like, electrical power generation from a windmill, like, you have to adjust things. You don't get that with a nuclear power plant, right? Your output wattage is controlled by the amount of fissile material that's in there and the control rods and all the other stuff. Just go watch the HBO show Chernobyl. They'll give you a great lesson in nuclear power. But more importantly, as demand increases, you can increase the amount of energy there. You can bring new reactors online, because here's something a lot of people don't know. Only one of the reactors at 3 Mile Island shut down. The rest of them ran for years. Even the other reactors at Chernobyl ran for years. In fact, I believe they're still running because it turns out that you kind of need that to generate power. But what we've got to do is we've got to get these companies to kind of get over this stigma of nuclear power being, quote unquote, bad. If you consider the number of times that we've had other kinds of energy outages over the years, coal power plants and other kinds of unsavory stuff, nuclear power is relatively safe. The unsafe part is, how do we get rid of the material? But if you want a good primer on how nuclear power works, there's a YouTube channel out there run by a guy named Kyle Hill that is amazing for you to check this stuff out. I think we're going to start having a lot more conversations about nuclear power going forward, because we have infrastructure in place from a lot of reactors. We have the ability to scale those reactors up relatively quickly, and we're not dependent on natural resources. But I stress this: we should not shut down our existing clean energy efforts. Nuclear power should go to augment additional drain on the power grids. This is for AI. This is for crypto mining. This is for all those other things. By the way, get some of those crypto miners to pay for the renovations that 3 Mile Island's going to need, because I promise you, they have a lot of fake money, and we can use that to do stuff. All right, Jack, F5 has launched Nginx One. It's an integrated application networking platform that simplifies the management, load balancing, API, cybersecurity across a variety of hybrid cloud environments. It's a SaaS platform, and it centralizes deployment and management of Nginx interfaces. Then it also provides all those cool things like telemetry and AI capabilities, which helps, of course, streamline DevOps workflows. It also reduces complexity of managing modern cloud-native applications. By enabling more dynamic and flexible provisioning of networking services, the aim of Nginx One is to replace rigid legacy approaches and adapt evolving IT needs. It sounds like this is something that a lot of people are really interested in a modern environment. What are some of the benefits of Nginx One that you see?
Well, I think it's really that modernization from, as you said, the rigid legacy approaches. And let's sort of talk about that. In the olden days, you built a monolithic application. It had one network interface and it talked to the world. And then we realized that we needed to do a little bit of load balancing. So we had this rigid application, couldn't do much with it. So we put another device in front of it that provided additional network ports and additional load balancing. And it could actually then direct traffic to multiple instances of this monolithic application. As we started moving from rigid application, monolithic, giant applications into containers, Kubernetes, and serverless type environments in the modern DevOps world, we now have multiple interfaces, multiple network interfaces, multiple ways to talk to the application. Plus, we have application programming interfaces and user interfaces, and they come off different network ports. And we have multiple instances spread throughout the world because we have to serve global customer bases. So that means we have a very complex network environment where our applications need to be able to support multiple network interfaces and multiple ports, multiple communication channels. And managing that can be very complex. It can be even harder when your application developers are focused on developing the application and may not understand the implications of various different network issues. So I think with this Nginx One SaaS interface, we now have a management plane, control plane that enables application developers to very simply and easily build applications without really focusing on the network side of the world. And this simplification will really help developers focus on the core features and functionality of the application, not so much on the networking, not so much on the load balancing, and hand that off to basically the pros in the business. Coming from F5, which actually developed the original load balancers, I think this is a great move, and to provide a SaaS interface and to have basically a modern DevOps interface to the networking environment. So I think there's a lot of interest, and this is going to be provide a lot of simplification for the developers and the ability to move faster, and as we like to say in sort of startup land, move faster, break things faster, and build better tools. So in something near and dear to my heart, Tom, it looks like NIST is changing password guidelines. In a new draft with a boring name, NIST is making suggestions about password policies. First and foremost, getting rid of the change password frequently requirement. Now we're getting into supporting longer passwords, longer minimum length and longer maximum lengths, and providing Unicode options, and even guidance on password hints and knowledge-based questions. However, as is typical with standards documents, the prompts fall back on things like shall and should variations, which means we may not get everything that we want. Tom, what's NIST's thinking here?
NIST's thinking is that people are really bad at password hygiene, and we've got to do everything we can to make that better. They basically have said, stop using complexity requirements as your barrier to entry, right? And they know that there's a reason for that. Anybody who is well-versed in the internet's favorite leet speak knows this. Ones and L's become exclamation points, twos become ats, and A's become ats. And you have a password that looks very secure and is about 3 seconds faster to crack because you create basically the equivalencies in your cracking tool. John the Ripper is really good at this stuff. But what they realized is that most people do that for mnemonic reasons, right? Whereas we've known for a really long time that passphrases are much more secure because what they allow us to do is have kind of a cognitive password. For example, if you'll allow me to nerd out for just a second, if you've ever read any books from the Battletech universe, you know that mechs have a startup sequence and they have a check code that is unique to each individual mech warrior. And so they have to speak the phrase in their own tone of voice with their own cadence. And if the mech detects that that's not the case, it locks them out. That was a brilliant idea that we came up with in the 80s, because what we realized is that I may know a thing that nobody else knows, right? Think about Captain Marvel. Tell me something that is quirky about you that nobody else knows, as a way to prove that you're not a Skrull. But here, we've always had a problem with that. Why? Because you can't put a space in a password. Well, NIST is saying now all printable ASCII characters should be allowed to be valid password characters, including the space, because we shouldn't be delimiting passwords with spaces anymore, because we should be hashing them and checking the hash value to determine if they're valid. Also, Unicode characters that only take up one character. That was one of the other big problems we had. Unicode is bigger. It's more bits per storage character, so passwords were growing out of whatever. I also like the fact that the password hint should not be given to an unauthenticated user in plain text. Like, that's a biggie, right? Like, don't let people guess your password hints. Also, knowledge-based questions. We've got to come up with better ways to do that, because I can find out what the first make and model of your car was. I can find out what street you lived on as a kid. Hell, there are Facebook like memes dedicated to that, right? I much prefer was it the nihilistic version? You know, when was the first year that you finally gave up hope? Because as it's joking as it sounds, that's actually not something that you can Google. But again, kind of like you mentioned, any standards document is going to run into one big problem. What should you do versus what do you have to do? I am a huge, don't put shall, put should. And if you look down this document, there's a lot of shoulds that are like the bare minimum, right? Like, you shall offer a password up to 64 characters in length. You should require 8. There's a big difference between those two. So I think hopefully with NIST putting these policies out here and kind of driving forward with what we need to do, I hope that a lot of companies are going to adopt them. But more importantly, just like any way to get this done, I hope that NIST requires anybody doing business with the U.S. federal government to adopt these and require certain minimums. I mean, that's how we've driven IPv6 adoption for the last couple of years, is that you basically have to have it if you want to do business with the government, because there's no better way to enforce a rule than to make it a rule. So good luck to the folks at NIST, and, keep on passwording. All right, Jack, we had a few stories that we wanted to take a little bit of a closer look at, because they all kind of revolve around a theme about AI safety. So we're calling this our AI safety roundup. The first one is a story that we kind of picked apart, if you want to call it that, earlier on the rundown, and that's from our good old friends at Microsoft. They've announced a significant overhaul of that controversial AI-powered recall feature. Now, you may remember that it was kind of one of those things that allowed you to record stuff that was going on in your PC, and the innocent reasoning behind it was, oh, if you ever make a mistake or you forget what you were doing, you could go back and figure things out. Well, a lot of people didn't like that. And there were huge privacy concerns, right? Somebody can go back and dig things out. Well, they responded to those concerns by implementing full encryption, virtualization-based security, and Windows Hello authentication for the feature, especially the ones that are taking screenshots of user activity. It also includes the ability to completely uninstall recall. Yay! Of course, that is at odds with the approach that they're taking to integrating AI capabilities deeply into Windows, as the investors are clamoring for, because AI is the new oil. And that means that they're going to be prioritizing things like user control and data protection and giving the control of this back to the users. So, Jack, I'm going to let you jump in here because you're a big security and privacy advocate. Is Microsoft going far enough with recall to say definitively that we've slayed this beast?
Yes, I think they are actually, and I find it's surprising. I find myself saying that. So I think there's a couple things that are very important here. First is moving it from a mandatory to an opt-in experience, and the second is making sure you can, when you uninstall it, that it removes everything from the system. So that's really big on the privacy concern. The other thing they've done, which I think is really key and important, is the database that stores all of the AI data, your screenshots and whatever else it captures, is protected by your TPM, your trusted platform module, which means that only you can authorize anybody to get to it. Even if someone who has an administrator rights on the PC can't get to that database and can't decrypt it to get access to the contents without you being there and somehow physically being present and authorizing it with your PIN, your face, or your fingerprints. So I think that's really key from the privacy concerns. Now, the other part of this that I think people sometimes forget is these types of features have been around for many years, and they've been incorporated into insider threat security tools. So there are a number of tools, whether it's a specific insider threat tool or a corporate CASB cloud access security broker tool or other tools that will record user actions when they're going to a corporate website. Or corporate, or for developers accessing corporate infrastructure. So the tools themselves have been around a long time. It's simply that this type of tool has been included as part of the operating system from Microsoft. But from a security and privacy perspective, that you're giving the user total control over this, I think is very important and key. The other thing I think is Microsoft is really, there's a big push here that these are all tied towards Microsoft's Copilot Plus PC. So it's really a move to get users to buy a new PC. So it's being pushed not only by Microsoft, but by all the hardware developers.
So the first thing I will say is this is what Microsoft should have done 3 years ago when they released Windows 11. They should have tied features directly to the TPM because TPM is required to install Windows 11. So spoiler alert out there, guys, you can't get this with Windows 10. And I know a lot of you were looking at doing that. I love the fact that you can rip the whole thing out. Listen, I'm running the beta for Apple Intelligence on my laptop right now, or my iPad right now. It needs some polish. They all do. So far, nothing's given me pause, but I'm also not worried because I've seen the documentation of what Apple's doing with Apple Intelligence and how much of it's on device versus being, somewhere else, and what I have control over and what I can see and what I can tweak and tune and all that other stuff. But I think that the last point that you made is kind of critical, and it's not a positive critical. The reason why they want everybody to go out and buy these new Copilot Plus PCs is because they have those NPUs in them. And if you don't have Copilot installed, do you really need an NPU? I don't think it's massively increased the MSRP of these laptops because they have extra hardware in there. But I also worry that the reason why they weren't massively increased was the same reason that you can't buy a non-smart TV anymore, is because basically the people who are putting the smart features in there are underwriting this. And I wondered, how much access are we going to get to the Copilot data that we've collected? I would hope the answer is none, but I'm also a security nerd, and I know that the answer is probably not that. So we'll see if Microsoft neutering recall to appeal to a privacy conscious group of people out there is actually going to sink their efforts to sell more Copilot PCs. I hope not.
Well, I hope not too, but I really think that what we don't know right now is really how useful the recall feature is going to be. And that's really what's going to drive adoption more than anything else. And because recall is designed to be more useful over time as it learns more and more about you and your behaviors, we won't really know the true utility for months, if not years. So I think the next sort of safety topic, AI safety topic we want to talk about was California Governor Gavin Newsom vetoed California Senate Bill 1047 this week. And this bill was aimed at regulating AI models and forcing developers to impose safety and kill switches. And Newsom stated the reason behind the veto is the specifics behind the size of the model would be subject to scrutiny. The model really, the size limits were based on the amount of dollars used to create the model, and it was something like 100 million. So that really was only a few of the very large models, and a lot of the smaller models wouldn't be subject to it. So he said that basically some of the smaller models could be more harmful as a result because they wouldn't be subject to this. There were proponents on both sides of the aisle supporting and defending this, and it's really the AI aisle, not the Republican Democrat aisle. But so what's really the issue here? And is the regulation crucial, or does it go far enough, or doesn't it go far enough, Tom?
It doesn't go far enough. And I'll tell you why, is because when you end up getting into a point where you have to compromise on these things, you have to draw a line somewhere, right? And Newsom, or at least the sponsors of the bill, thought that the line to draw was north of this, dollar amount, right? Well, like you said, there aren't a whole lot of models out there that are north of that dollar amount. It just so happens that the ones that are the companies that everybody is so concerned about, like OpenAI and Google and other ones. But there's nothing to say that I can't game the system, right? So let's say the line's $100 million. Okay. So I drop off and I say, I'm going to create this new OpenAI model. We'll call it Not Evil AI. As long as I only put $90 million worth of research into Not Evil AI, I'm not subject to any of that stuff. And if it looks like I'm about to go over, I fork that model and recreate it again, starting from zero, so that all of my models are iterative. I'm still getting the same results in different projects, only now they're under the threshold for reporting. And then you're going to have someone go, oh, well, we've got to lower the threshold. So they take it down to, I don't know, $50 million. Well, now when the project gets to $45 million, I just fork it again. Do you see how when you draw a line in the sand, you're always going to have people who are dancing on either side of that line, right? The problem isn't tagging things. The problem is you've got to look at what's going on. You have to have more comprehensive regulation, and you're going to have to pick a different way to do it. And here's the problem. You're going to have people who are going to get really furious at you that you're trying to stifle their competition and censor them. And yes, that's exactly what we're doing. Because, and this is one of my favorite talking points recently, what is the point of a corporation? It is to make money. Yeah, throw all the nonprofit crap out the window, which is what we're going to talk about here in a minute. The purpose of a company is to make money and not break the law, because breaking the law leads to fines and all kinds of other stuff, which means you make less money. It does not say anything about taking care of the workers, bettering society, or, keeping people from getting chopped up in sausage making machines. That's things that we've had to add protections in to prevent things from, like, I don't know, catching the Cuyahoga River on fire because it's cheaper to dump chemicals in it than it is to have them sent somewhere else. We have to have good regulation on this. And this is an emerging area that we know very little about. Even the experts in the field don't know a whole lot about it. So how can you regulate it? Well, you're going to have to do research. You're going to have to take a few shots at this law and get it right over time. The problem is, we're also facing an election year here in the US. And so people needed to feel like they had to get something out there to say that they were looking at the problem. But when you rush legislation out to appease the vocal minority, whoever they happen to be, you're going to get it wrong every time. Mark my words. What you've got to do is you got to take a more measured approach and make sure you're getting everything. Because anybody who's ever played online games know, as soon as you make a rule, there's going to be a group of people that are going to try to exploit right up to that rule and then claim, well, it wasn't against the rule. Why did you ban me from doing this? And I think that's what we're kind of getting into now. It's the whole, like, if this car weighs 5,000 pounds less, then it's technically not classified as a light truck, so it doesn't have to meet these certain MPG guidelines. And if you wanted to know why every pickup truck on the road is so friggin' enormous now, it literally is to beat MPG requirements. So, Jack, I mean, am I off base here? Or should we have passed this bill and just said, YOLO, deal with the consequences?
No, I don't think you're off base. And this is always the challenge with regulation is, or I should say high-tech regulation is, high-tech moves at a pace that is much faster, orders of magnitude faster than government. And governments and regulators are always, behind the curve and chasing their tails, trying to figure out how to regulate something that's moving so quickly. And as you said, there's also always the opportunity to game the system. So I think the legislature needs to basically say, we understand that. Let's take a moment, do our research, and say, how can we craft a regulation that protects everybody while not stifling innovation and not just making it so that it's so obvious about how to work around the regulations to get what we want, which is more money.
All right. Well, I alluded to it, but you remember that great OpenAI power struggle? Man, it seems like it was forever ago. I looked it up. It was actually November of last year. It was 11 months. I guess it's time for another one. In this particular case, CTO Mira Murati, Research VP Barrett Zoff, and Chief Research Officer Bob McGrew all announced that they were leaving basically at the same time. You may wonder, man, when executives bail out on a company, what's happening? Well, we saw a story coming in from Reuters that said that OpenAI is potentially going to restructure the company away from that nonprofit focus and look more like a startup that would consolidate a whole lot of power in CEO Sam Altman. Oh, you remember Sam Altman, the guy that got fired in that power struggle back in November because people feared that he was taking the company in the wrong direction. And then, of course, he managed to stage a reverse coup and get all of his unfriendly people unseated from the board and took back over. And yeah, we never talked about that again, right? I mean, where do we even start unpacking this whole thing? You've got three major high-profile people in the company that all announced they're all leaving within like a day of each other. You've got a news story coming out saying you're trying to consolidate power. Man, if this was like 17th century Europe, I would expect a Spanish armada to come sailing out of San Francisco Bay anytime soon.
Well, that's an interesting analogy, and I think it's actually a very apt analogy because really there's two things going on here. One is we are discovering the new world of AI, and two, as you talked about in our previous segment, there's a tremendous amount of money involved. And I mean, let's be real, this is real money that is unheard of back for startups in any other environment. We're talking about funding rounds of hundreds of millions to billions of dollars, as opposed to $5 to $10 million funding or $20 or $30 million funding rounds. So I think people are looking at this from inside and outside OpenAI and outside in the rest of the AI world and saying, there's all this money floating around. I need to grab a piece of that cash before it disappears. Now, if you look at, let's talk about people first and then the company. If you think about the people first, how much salary can they get by being part of a nonprofit such as OpenAI? It's clear that people think that they can go in the open market, just like a professional sports player, and in open bidding get a lot more money. And I think that's probably behind the motivations. They may speak and wave their hands around the mission and various other concerns, but the amount of money that's floating around in AI is truly stunning. I think the second thing is when you look at the company in OpenAI and what OpenAI wants to do, what they really want to do, they can only do by being a public company, a for-profit company rather than a non-for-profit. And they're talking about needing investments in the hundreds of billions of dollars because they want to invest billions of dollars in data centers alone to support all of the models that they're building. When you look at all this money swimming around, like I said, who wouldn't want a piece of that? And I don't see this stopping anytime soon.
No, and I'll be honest here. I'm prognosticating and getting on my little soapbox a little bit. This has never been about whether or not OpenAI is a nonprofit. I mean, realistically speaking, they haven't been a nonprofit for years because they've always been focused on making money. But being a nonprofit gives them a shield whenever they're losing money hand over fist because nobody cares about AI. And it was great when, you could talk about all the philanthropic work you're doing and deduct it off of your taxes and all this other stuff. And then a funny thing happened. Everybody wanted AI all of a sudden. And the genie was out of the bottle. And now there's billions, if not trillions of dollars floating around out there that people are literally willing to sink into anything. It's the Beanie Babies craze all over again. I don't care if it says Bernie Babies. It looks like a Beanie Baby, and I'm going to buy into it. But then Altman ran into a problem. I'm a nonprofit. I can't make money. And so now he's going to have to transform the company because that pretty little shield is now a wall keeping him from being the next Jensen Huang. So what is ultimately going to happen is they are going to have to transform the company. But when you hired a whole bunch of people on the premise that you were going to be doing nonprofit good works using AI for all these other things, that money grab looks a little bad. And I will admit, you're absolutely right. It's, the scene in Beverly Hills Cop. It's like, in this one hand, I've got all of my outrage at the fact that the company is doing bad things. and I want to go somewhere else. What if I gave you something in this hand that would make you forget about what's in this hand? Say, like, I don't know, like $15 million a year. I forgot all about my outrage. AI is totally fine, however we want to use it. What I would say is, if you want to make a stand against Sam Altman and his plans to do whatever he's going to do with AI, make another nonprofit foundation, take a small salary, and fight against it. Create better regulation. Work on ways to hamstring what he's doing, not how he's doing it. Because as we learned last November, while he may have detractors inside of the company, he has powerful friends that will do whatever it takes to make sure his vision is executed. And if that makes him sound like the Emperor from Star Wars, you're not far off. And that's the problem that we're dealing with here, is there's only so many people inside of a company that can stand up and do this. And the worst part is, the people who are quitting in droves are the executives who have no real power to impact this. Who are the ones who are still there doing the work? People who are writing the code and creating iterations to make more money. And I'm sure that they are incentivized to do that. But if the people who are doing the day-to-day work all suddenly up and left OpenAI because they were protesting what Sam was doing, I promise you he'd change his tune really fast. When the money hose gets turned off, suddenly you don't make it so well anymore. It's been a busy week, but luckily we have a lot of great stuff coming up that we want to tell you about. We have just finished posting a whole lot of videos from the events that we've been doing for the last few weeks, including AI Field Day 5, Edge Field Day 3. I just finished posting the videos that we recorded at Networking Field Day at Nokia last week. They're up now. If you want to go check those out, Nokia EDA is a really cool platform. And if you're wondering why Steven's not here, it's because he's currently in the middle of AI Data Infrastructure Field Day number 1. That's going to be Google Cloud, HPE, Infinidat, MinIO, Pure Storage, and Solidigm. We're going to take a week off. Steven's got some stuff going on. I've got some stuff going on. And then I'm going to be back in San Francisco for Security Field Day 12. We're going to be hearing from Citrix, Dell, DigiCert, and SonicWall. And then literally the next week, Steven's back at it again with Cloud Field Day. So make sure you are going to techfieldday.com to check out all the list of all of the things that are going on. We have the schedule line up through the rest of the year, and you're going to want to set your calendars because there's a lot of stuff that you don't want to miss. Jack, speaking of that, if there's stuff that people don't want to miss that you're involved in, where can they go to find that out?
Well, ironically, I'm actually going to be joining Stephen for Cloud Field Day 21, and I was with him for both AI Field Day 5 and Edge Field Day 3, so it's going to be a reunion of sorts. We learned a lot of great stuff at both of those. It's definitely worthwhile watching. I'll just note that, we talked today about the power requirements for AI and nuclear power coming on. And we learned at AI Field Day 5 that a single 6-foot rack for doing AI training consumes 120 kilowatts. That's the equivalent of 10 houses of electricity. That's why the nuclear power is becoming so important. And also part of what's driving the need for so much money being invested in OpenAI and all the other AI companies.
Well, we appreciate that, and we look forward to seeing you again as a part of our wonderful field day. And if you are a fan of our rundown, we hope that you join us every Wednesday for our new episodes. They are broadcast on YouTube as well as in your favorite podcast application of choice if you prefer the audio-only version. We also feature these on our sister site at Techstrong TV. And you can catch us on all the other Techstrong and Futurum Group properties out there. We'll be back next Wednesday to talk about all of the cool stuff that happened between, right now and then. And if you have anything you'd like to let us know about, make sure you send that over. We're on all the social medias, or you can just drop us an email. We're always happy to do that. But we look forward to your feedback. We look forward to reading your comments and hearing your rave reviews, or maybe fixing your not so rave ones. But until next week, make sure that you stay a little bit spooky, but not too spooky. And keep an eye out for those AIs that are listening in on you. We'll be back with more great episodes of The Rundown next week. We'll see you soon.